In the heart of a city that worshipped gods of commerce, where steel and glass cathedrals pierced the clouds, and ambition flowed through the streets like electricity through wire, the Sterling Tower stood apart. It rose from the concrete and asphalt like a shard of obsidian, a monument to ruthless ambition. 72 stories of black marble and tinted glass that reflected the world, but revealed nothing of what lay within. At night, when the city's million windows glowed like scattered embers, Sterling Tower remained dark, save for a single light at its summit, the office of Arthur Sterling himself. He was not merely a man, he was an event, a phenomenon, a billionaire titan whose moods could shift global markets, whose signature on a document could mean prosperity for thousands or ruin for thousands more. Financial magazines called him the architect of the modern economy. His enemies, and there were many, called him something else entirely. But Arthur Sterling did not concern himself with the opinions of lesser beings. His philosophy was brutally simple, honed over 40 years of conquest. The world was a jungle, and he was its apex predator. Weakness, imperfection, and mediocrity were not just flaws to him, they were sins, punishable by erasure. He had built his empire on the bones of competitors who had shown mercy, on the graves of companies that had valued compassion over efficiency. In Sterling's world, there was no room for sentiment. There was only the relentless, grinding machinery of profit and power. His office reflected this philosophy. It was not warm or welcoming. It was a testament to dominance. The floor was polished black granite, so reflective it looked like standing water. The walls were adorned with what he called his wall of victories, gleaming silver trophies from industry awards, framed magazine covers featuring his cold smile, photographs with presidents and prime ministers who had bent to his will. His desk, carved from a single piece of rare Brazilian mahogany, was the size of a small car. Behind it, floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the city like the view from Olympus. Everything in that room cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime. Everything was perfect. Everything was clean. Everything was exactly as Arthur Sterling demanded it to be. And far below, in the quiet humility of the service corridors where the fluorescent lights hummed and flickered, where the air smelled of industrial cleaner and the walls were painted institutional beige, was Elena Morales. At 58, she was a woman carved from resilience. Her hands, calloused and strong despite their delicate size, told the story of decades of labor. Her face bore the lines of a life that had not been easy. Laugh lines around her eyes from better times, worry lines across her forehead for harder ones. Her hair, once jet black, was now streaked with silver that she pulled back into a simple bun each night before her shift began. Elena's life had not followed the path she had once imagined. As a young woman in her 20s, newly arrived from Mexico with dreams as big as the American sky, she had believed in the promise of this country. She had met Roberto Morales at a community center English class. He was a quiet man with kind eyes and strong hands, a factory worker who believed in honest labor and treating people with dignity. They had married in a small ceremony with borrowed flowers and a cake made by friends. Their daughter, Sophia, had been born 2 years later, and Elena had thought her life was complete. Roberto had worked at the Riverside manufacturing plant, one of Sterling's earliest acquisitions. He had been on the factory floor the day a critical safety sensor malfunctioned, a sensor that maintenance reports showed should have been replaced months earlier, but the replacement had been deemed an unnecessary expense in a cost-cutting memo that Elena would not see until many years later. The boiler explosion killed Roberto and 4 other men instantly. The company settled with the families quietly, quickly, for amounts that barely covered funeral expenses. There had been no admission of fault, no apology, just a check and a legal document that forbade the families from ever speaking publicly about the incident. Elena had been 32 years old, suddenly alone with a 10-year-old daughter and a future that had collapsed like a building with its foundation removed. She had done what she had to do. She had worked. She had survived. She had cleaned offices, scrubbed floors, washed dishes in restaurant kitchens. She had raised Sophia with fierce, protective love, teaching her daughter that dignity was not something others could give or take away. It was something you carried inside yourself, regardless of what work you did or how little money you had. Sophia had grown into a strong, beautiful young woman. She had inherited her father's kindness and her mother's determination. She worked 2 jobs, as a home health aide during the day and a waitress 3 nights a week, and she did both with grace and compassion. When Sophia had become pregnant at 22, the father, a boy too young and too scared to face responsibility, had vanished. Sophia had cried for 1 night in her mother's arms. The next morning she had dried her tears and prepared for motherhood with the same quiet strength Elena had shown her entire life. And then Leo had been born. Lionel Roberto Morales, named for his grandmother and the grandfather he would never meet. From the moment Elena held him in the hospital, still red-faced and wrinkled but perfect, she had known that this child was the reason for everything she had endured. He was the sun in her universe, the light that made the darkness bearable. But even the brightest light can cast shadows. By the time Leo was 2, his breathing had begun to concern them. The wheezing that started as an occasional thing became constant. The pediatrician at the free clinic had referred them to a specialist, and the specialist delivered the diagnosis with clinical detachment. A rare form of chronic respiratory condition, complex and progressive. It was manageable with the right medication and treatment, but it was expensive. Crushingly expensive. The medication that kept Leo's airways open, that let him run and play and laugh like other children, cost $800 a month, even with insurance. The insurance Sophia had through her jobs was minimal, covering only a fraction of the cost. The co-pays, the specialist visits, the emergency room trips when Leo had a bad episode, they added up to a mountain of medical debt that grew taller every month. So Elena's job at Sterling Corp was more than a job. It was Leo's lifeline. It was the medication that let him breathe. It was the difference between her grandson having a childhood and spending it in a hospital bed. Every night, as she took the service elevator up to the executive floors, Elena carried with her the weight of that responsibility. She had been a ghost in Sterling's gleaming machine for 10 years. 10 years of arriving at midnight, when the executives had long gone home to their mansions and penthouses. 10 years of pushing her cleaning cart through silent hallways that smelled of expensive cologne and ambition. 10 years of emptying wastebaskets filled with the detritus of power, crumpled strategy memos, half-eaten gourmet lunches that cost more than her weekly grocery budget, discarded first-class boarding passes to cities she would never see. She knew the executives by their leavings. The chief financial officer who ate the same spinach salad every day and listened to opera on his computer. The vice president of acquisitions, who chewed nicotine gum obsessively and left angry voicemails that Elena could hear through his office door. The junior analysts who worked until 3 in the morning, their desks covered with empty energy drink cans and desperate coffee-stained notes that read like prayers. Make this work. Don't screw this up. They're watching. She had cleaned Arthur Sterling's palatial office over 2,000 times. She knew its geography better than her own small apartment. She knew that he kept exactly 3 pens on his desk, always perfectly aligned. She knew that he had a habit of leaving single drops of scotch in the crystal glass on his sidebar, as if he couldn't quite finish anything, always needing something to leave behind. She knew the exact weight of each of his trophies, had polished every inch of every frame on his wall of victories. Yet in all that time, in 10 years and 2,000 nights, Arthur Sterling had never once met her gaze, had never acknowledged her existence beyond the most basic, dismissive gestures. Once, 3 years ago, she had been dusting near his desk while he was on a late conference call. He had gestured at her, not looked at her, just waved his hand in an irritated shooing motion, as if she were an insect that had wandered into his field of vision. She was part of the building's ambient noise, as unnoticeable as the hum of the air conditioning or the distant rumble of the city below. In Arthur Sterling's world, Elena Morales was utterly and completely invisible. The Tuesday that changed everything had started like any other. Elena had woken at 6 in the evening, her internal clock long ago adjusted to her nocturnal schedule. She had made dinner for Sophia and Leo, chicken and rice, simple and filling. Leo had been having a good day, his breathing clear, his energy high. He had chattered excitedly about a field trip to the science museum his school was planning, about the dinosaurs he would see. Abuela, he had said, using the Spanish word for grandmother that always made Elena's heart swell. Did you know that some dinosaurs were as big as buildings? The teacher said they were so big that when they walked, the ground shook. Elena had smiled, running her hand through his soft, dark hair. That is amazing, mijo. Maybe one day you will be a scientist who studies dinosaurs. Or maybe a doctor, Leo had said, suddenly serious, so I can help other kids who can't breathe good like me. The simple, pure-hearted compassion of that statement had nearly broken Elena. This 7-year-old boy, who struggled for every breath, wanted to grow up to help others. She had pulled him into a fierce hug, blinking back tears. Before her shift, Elena had stopped at Henderson's Pharmacy, a small, family-owned shop 3 blocks from their apartment. Mr. Henderson, a gentle man in his 60s with wire-rimmed glasses and a kind smile, had been their pharmacist for years. He knew Leo's name, always asked about him, sometimes slipped a lollipop into the prescription bag. But that evening, when Elena had approached the counter, Mr. Henderson's usual smile had been replaced by an apologetic, pained expression. "Elena," he had said softly, "I'm so sorry. I tried to reach you earlier today." Is something wrong? Elena had felt her stomach tighten with instinctive dread. The insurance company rejected the claim this month. They're saying the prior authorization expired and needs to be renewed. I've been trying to reach Dr. Patel's office, but you know how it is. They're backed up. It might take a week or 2 to process. He had paused, looking genuinely distressed. And there's the matter of your account balance. It's at $300 now. Corporate policy says I can't release the refill until the balance is cleared or we have a payment plan in place. $300. It might as well have been $3 million. Elena's bank account had $67 in it. Sophia's was even worse. They were already 2 months behind on rent, only staying in their apartment because their landlord, Mrs. Chen, was kind and patient, and remembered what it was like to be young and struggling. "How long?" Elena had asked, her voice barely a whisper. "How long until Leo needs his next dose?" Mr. Henderson had checked his computer, and the pause before he answered told Elena everything she needed to know. "He should have had it 3 days ago. The prescription he has now, if you're rationing it, maybe you have a week left. But Elena, that's dangerous. The longer he goes without proper dosing." "I know," Elena had interrupted. She couldn't bear to hear the words spoken aloud. "I will figure something out. Thank you, Mr. Henderson." She had walked to the bus stop in a daze. The image of Leo's small face, the wheeze that had started to creep back into his breathing the past few nights, was burned into her mind. $300. 1 week. The math was simple and terrible. The ride to Sterling Tower had felt longer than usual. Elena had stared out the window at the passing city, the bright storefronts she couldn't afford to enter, the restaurants where a single meal cost more than her weekly food budget, the people hurrying home from their day jobs while she headed to her night one. The city sparkled with wealth and possibility, but none of it was for her. She was just passing through, a ghost moving through a world that had long ago decided she didn't matter. By the time she arrived at Sterling Tower, her hands were shaking. She had gone through her security check with Felix, the night guard, who had nodded at her with his usual tired smile. "Evening, Mrs. Morales. Quiet night so far." "That is good," she had replied automatically, her mind 1,000 miles away. The service elevator had carried her up to the executive floor, 72 stories in 45 seconds. The ascent always made her ears pop. When the doors opened, she had stepped out into the silent, carpeted hallway. Motion sensor lights flickered on as she walked, pushing her cleaning cart toward Arthur Sterling's office at the far end of the corridor. The fragile equilibrium of her world was about to shatter. Arthur Sterling should not have been there. On a typical Tuesday at midnight, his office was dark and empty, a shrine waiting for its god to return. But as Elena approached, she saw light spilling out from under his door, heard the low, dangerous rumble of his voice. She hesitated, her hand on the handle of her cart. She could wait, come back later. But she had learned long ago that deviation from routine drew attention, and attention from management was never good for people like her. Better to slip in quietly, do her work quickly, and slip out unnoticed. He had ignored her for 10 years. Tonight would be no different. She knocked softly, a gentle, apologetic sound, and opened the door. Sterling was a storm contained within a suit. He stood by his floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to her. Even from across the vast expanse of his office, Elena could feel the fury radiating from him like heat from a furnace. He was in his late 50s, tall and angular, with iron-gray hair swept back from a face that looked like it had been carved from granite with harsh, aggressive strokes. He wore a suit that probably cost more than Elena made in a year, and he wore it like armor. "Find their weakness, Harrison," he commanded, his voice a low, controlled growl that somehow felt more threatening than shouting. "I don't care if you have to dig through their garbage or hack their email. Every company, every person has a pressure point, something they love, something they fear, something they can't afford to lose. Find it and break it. I want Ethereum Dynamics on their knees by Friday, begging me to buy them." There was a pause as the person on the other end, Harrison apparently, responded. Sterling's reflection in the window showed a face twisted with contempt. No, Harrison, I don't care about their innovative culture or their passionate team. Those are liabilities, not assets. Passion makes people stupid. It makes them fight when they should surrender. I need you to show them that fighting me is futile. Make an example of someone. Their CTO, maybe. Find out what he's hiding. Everyone's hiding something. Threaten to expose it. Make him afraid. Fear is always more effective than force. Another pause. Then, more quietly, but somehow more chillingly, "And Harrison, if you can't deliver this by Friday, clean out your desk on Monday. I have no use for weapons that don't fire when I pull the trigger." He ended the call without waiting, letting the phone clatter onto his desk with a sound like breaking glass. Elena, her mind still on the pharmacy and Leo's empty inhaler, moved around him with the practiced silence of a ghost. She began her routine, starting with the leather chairs around his conference table. She wiped down each surface with methodical care, making herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. Sterling paced like a caged panther, pulling up documents on his tablet, making notes with sharp, angry strokes. He muttered to himself, fragments of sentences that painted a picture of a man obsessed with conquest. Their patents are worthless if they can't defend them in court. 3 years of litigation, they'll bleed out before we do. Breakup value is actually higher than acquisition price if we strip the assets. Elena moved to his wall of victories, beginning the delicate process of dusting each frame. This part always took the longest. There were 47 frames in total, she had counted them once, each one a monument to Sterling's dominance. She had memorized their arrangement, knew them as well as she knew the faces of her own family. Her dusting cloth, a piece of microfiber that had once been white but now gray from years of use, was beginning to fray. She had noticed it last week, made a mental note to replace it, but then Leo's medication had come due and the cloth had been forgotten. As she gently wiped a heavy silver frame, Sterling with a senator at some gala, both men smiling the practiced smiles of predators, her worn cloth snagged on a sharp, ornate corner of the frame. Time seemed to slow down. The frame tipped forward, striking the one beside it. The sound was soft, a metallic clink, no louder than a fallen coin. But in the tense silence of that room, with Sterling's fury hanging in the air like static before a lightning strike, it was a thunderclap. Sterling ended his pacing abruptly. His entire body went rigid. "Hold," he said into the phone he had just picked up again, his voice suddenly, terrifyingly calm. He let the phone drop back to its cradle with deliberate precision. His head turned slowly in her direction. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, pale blue and pitilessly cold, narrowed to slits. When Arthur Sterling looked at something, he didn't simply see it. He dissected it, calculated its value, and decided whether it deserved to continue existing. "What," he said, each word a chip of ice, "was that?" Elena's heart leaped into her throat. Her hands, already shaking from stress and exhaustion, began to tremble visibly. "Nothing, sir. I am so sorry. The cloth, it caught on the edge of the frame. It was an accident. I did not mean—" "Stop talking," Sterling commanded. The quiet authority in his voice was absolute. It was not a request. It was reality being dictated. He crossed the room with long, purposeful strides. Elena stepped back instinctively, pressing herself against the wall as if she could disappear into it. Sterling reached the wall of victories and picked up the frame she had touched, holding it up to the harsh, unforgiving light of his desk lamp. There, on the flawless surface of the glass, was a tiny smudge, barely visible, perhaps half an inch across, the ghost of her thumbprint, left when she had tried to steady the frame. Sterling stared at it for a full 10 seconds. The silence in the room became a heavy, suffocating presence. Elena could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, could feel the cold sweat breaking out on her back. Outside the windows, the city continued its indifferent dance. Cars moving, lights blinking, people living lives that had nothing to do with this moment. But inside this office, time had stopped. When Sterling finally spoke, his voice was dangerously, terrifyingly soft. "A smudge," he whispered, as if contemplating an act of cosmic heresy. "On this frame, on this glass, in this office." He turned slowly to look at her, and for the first time in 10 years, Arthur Sterling truly saw Elena Morales. But he didn't see a grandmother who loved her grandson more than life itself. He didn't see a widow who had rebuilt her world from ashes. He didn't see a woman who had cleaned his office 2,000 times with quiet dignity and flawless precision. He saw a defect, a piece of grit in his perfect machine, an imperfection that needed to be eliminated. "What," he began, his voice rising with each word, "what it takes to build an empire. Do you have even the faintest comprehension of the dedication, the obsession, the relentless pursuit of absolute perfection that this requires?" He gestured at the room around them, at his kingdom of glass and steel and power. Every detail matters. Every surface, every document, every single element must be exactly as it should be, because excellence is not an accident. It's not luck. It's the systematic elimination of every flaw, every weakness, every single imperfection. He looked back at the frame, at the tiny smudge, and his face twisted with something like pain, as if the imperfection physically hurt him. "I make decisions that affect millions of lives. Billions of dollars move based on my judgments. Governments court my favor. My competitors lie awake at night wondering what I'll do next. And you know why? Because I am perfect. Because I tolerate no deviation, no error, no compromise." He placed the frame back on the shelf with a sharp, final click that sounded like a judge's gavel. "But then," he continued, turning back to face her with cold contempt, "you bring your carelessness, your mediocrity, your filth into my world. You wallow in incompetence. You accept failure as inevitable. You are entropy in human form. Everything I have spent my life fighting against." Elena found her voice, driven by desperation. "Mr. Sterling, please, I am so sorry. It will not happen again. I have worked here for 10 years. I have always—" "10 years," Sterling interrupted, his voice sharp. "10 years of what? 10 years of doing the bare minimum to not get fired? That's not achievement. That's just existing. Barely. And I don't pay people to exist. I pay them to be excellent. You are not excellent. You are not even adequate." Please, Elena begged, her pride crumbling under the weight of Leo's face in her mind. Please, Mr. Sterling, I need this job. My grandson, he is 7 years old. He is sick. He has a condition with his lungs. The medication, it costs so much. Without my paycheck, I cannot afford it. Please, I will work harder. I will stop talking, Sterling commanded. The quiet authority in his voice was absolute. It was not a request. It was reality being dictated. He crossed the room with long, purposeful strides. Elena stepped back instinctively, pressing herself against the wall, as if she could disappear into it. Sterling reached the wall of victories and picked up the frame she had touched, holding it up to the harsh, unforgiving light of his desk lamp. There, on the flawless surface of the glass, was a tiny smudge, barely visible, perhaps half an inch across, the ghost of her thumbprint, left when she had tried to steady the frame. Sterling stared at it for a full 10 seconds. The silence in the room became a heavy, suffocating presence. Elena could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, could feel the cold sweat breaking out on her back. Outside the windows, the city continued its indifferent dance. Cars moving, lights blinking, people living lives that had nothing to do with this moment. But inside this office, time had stopped. When Sterling finally spoke, his voice was dangerously, terrifyingly soft. "A smudge," he whispered, as if contemplating an act of cosmic heresy. "On this frame, on this glass, in this office." He turned slowly to look at her, and for the first time in 10 years, Arthur Sterling truly saw Elena Morales. But he didn't see a grandmother who loved her grandson more than life itself. He didn't see a widow who had rebuilt her world from ashes. He didn't see a woman who had cleaned his office 2,000 times with quiet dignity and flawless precision. He saw a defect, a piece of grit in his perfect machine, an imperfection that needed to be eliminated. "Do you have any idea," he began, his voice rising with each word, "what it takes to build an empire? Do you have even the faintest comprehension of the dedication, the obsession, the relentless pursuit of absolute perfection that this requires?" He gestured at the room around them, at his kingdom of glass and steel and power. "Every detail matters. Every surface, every document, every single element must be exactly as it should be. Because excellence is not an accident. It's not luck. It's the systematic elimination of every flaw, every weakness, every single imperfection." He looked back at the frame, at the tiny smudge, and his face twisted with something like pain, as if the imperfection physically hurt him. "I make decisions that affect millions of lives. Billions of dollars move based on my judgments. Governments court my favor. My competitors lie awake at night wondering what I'll do next. And you know why? Because I am perfect. Because I tolerate no deviation, no error, no compromise." He placed the frame back on the shelf with a sharp, final click that sounded like a judge's gavel. "But then, people like you," he continued, turning back to face her with cold contempt, "you bring your carelessness, your mediocrity, your filth into my world. You wallow in incompetence. You accept failure as inevitable. You are entropy in human form, everything I have spent my life fighting against. Elena found her voice, driven by desperation. Mr. Sterling, please, I am very sorry. It will not happen again. I have worked here for 10 years. I have always... 10 years? Sterling interrupted, his voice sharp. 10 years of what? 10 years of doing the bare minimum to not get fired? That's not achievement. That's just existing. Barely. And I don't pay people to exist. I pay them to be excellent. You are not excellent. You are not even adequate. Please, Elena begged, her pride crumbling under the weight of Leo's face in her mind. Please, Mr. Sterling, I need this job. My grandson, he is 7 years old. He is sick. He has a condition with his lungs. The medication, it costs so much. Without my paycheck, I cannot afford it. Please, I will work harder. I will... Sterling held up one hand, silencing her with the gesture. For a moment, just a fleeting second, something flickered across his face. Curiosity, perhaps? Or the distant, clinical interest of a scientist observing a specimen. Your grandson, he repeated slowly, tasting the words. Sick. Expensive medication. He nodded, as if confirming a hypothesis. Let me tell you something about the world, Mrs. He paused, realized he didn't know her name, and didn't care enough to ask. Let me tell you something about the world, he continued. It's full of sick children. It's full of people who can't afford medication, who lose their jobs, who suffer and struggle and fail. That's not a tragedy. That's reality. That's nature selecting for strength and weeding out weakness. Your grandson's illness, your financial struggles, your problems, they're symptoms of a fundamental fact. You are not strong enough, smart enough, or valuable enough to thrive in this world. He walked to his desk, his back now to her, dismissing her with his posture. Elena Morales had been a minor irritation, a smudge to be wiped away. And now she was gone, already forgotten. The humiliation was a physical force, a hot wave that left Elena trembling. She stood there for a moment, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. 10 years. Gone. Leo's medication? Gone. Their apartment? Their future? Everything. Gone. Because of a half-inch smudge on a picture frame. Heavy footsteps approached from the hallway. Marcus Jensen, Sterling's head of security, appeared in the doorway. He was in his 40s, military short hair, cold eyes, a former intelligence officer who now served as Sterling's shadow. Behind him stood a younger security guard, barely 20, with the broad shoulders and uncomfortable expression of someone who didn't like what he was being asked to do, but lacked the courage to refuse. "Ma'am," Jensen said, his voice professionally neutral, "you need to come with us." Elena nodded mutely. She pushed her cleaning cart out of Sterling's office for the last time, past the sneering gargoyle of a man who had just destroyed her life with the same casual indifference someone might show when stepping on an insect. They led her to a small, sterile locker room in the basement, a place she had been 1,000 times, but which now felt like a prison. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a sickly greenish hue. The walls were cinder block, painted the color of old concrete. It smelled of industrial cleaner and despair. "You have 5 minutes," Jensen said. "Turn in your uniform, your badge, your access card. Clean out your locker, then you leave. If you ever attempt to return to this building, you will be arrested for trespassing. Do you understand?" "Yes," Elena whispered. Jensen and the young guard stepped outside, giving her what little privacy remained. Elena stood alone in that cold, ugly room and felt the full weight of her situation crash down on her. 10 years of her life were to be packed into a single plastic bag. She opened her locker with shaking hands. Inside was the modest archaeology of a decade. Her worn-out coat hanging on a hook, a half-eaten apple wrapped in a napkin, now irrelevant, a paperback novel in Spanish, dog-eared and read so much the spine had cracked, a small bottle of ibuprofen for the nights when her back ached so badly she could barely stand, and taped to the inside of the locker door, a photograph. It was Leo on his 6th birthday, taken just over a year ago. Sophia had managed to throw him a small party at their apartment. Nothing fancy, just cake and a few friends from school. Leo was wearing a paper crown, his face split in a grin so wide and pure it made the sun look dim. His eyes sparkled with joy. In that frozen moment, he wasn't a sick child fighting to breathe. He was just a little boy, happy and loved and full of hope for the future. Elena carefully peeled the photo from the locker door, her tears falling onto the picture, blurring Leo's beautiful face. "I am so sorry, mijo," she whispered to the photograph. "I am so sorry." She changed out of her uniform, the unflattering gray polyester dress she had worn for 10 years, and put on her street clothes. She packed her few possessions into the plastic bag. As she was closing her locker for the last time, her gaze drifted across the basement room. In the corner, next to a supply closet, sat a large industrial trash bin, the kind on wheels, used to collect the garbage from the executive floors before it was taken to the building's main disposal area. And on top of the bin, clearly visible, was a pile of trash from Sterling's office that hadn't yet been emptied. She could see discarded financial reports, crumpled sticky notes, an empty coffee cup with Sterling Corp's logo. And there, near the top of the pile, was a tightly crumpled ball of paper, the one Sterling had angrily thrown away during his phone call, right before Elena had made her fatal mistake. A strange, unfamiliar impulse took hold of her, a flicker of rebellion from a spirit she thought had long been beaten into submission. She glanced toward the door. Jensen and the guard were talking in the hallway, their voices a low murmur. She had perhaps 30 seconds, maybe less. Her hand, as if with a mind of its own, darted out. She snatched the crumpled paper ball, her fingers closing around it with surprising strength. It was small, solid, compact, compressed by Sterling's expensive hand into a tight sphere of anger. She quickly slipped it into her coat pocket, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was a meaningless gesture. Probably just another memo, another piece of the countless paperwork that flowed through Sterling's office like water through a river. But it was hers. The one piece of his world she could take with her, as he had just taken hers away. It was the protest of a ghost, small, futile, invisible. But it was hers. "Time's up," Jensen said from the doorway. Elena turned to face him, the plastic bag clutched in one hand, Leo's photograph in the other. She walked past Jensen and the young guard, who looked away, unable to meet her eyes, and out into the cold night. The service exit opened onto an alley behind Sterling Tower, a place of dumpsters and loading docks and the perpetual smell of garbage. The door clanged shut behind her with a sound of absolute finality. Elena stood in that alley, in the shadow of the tower that had consumed 10 years of her life, and realized she had no idea what came next. The city hummed around her, indifferent to her suffering. Above, she could see the single light at Sterling Tower's summit, Arthur Sterling's office, where he was probably already working on his next conquest, already calculating his next move in the chess game of empires. He had forgotten her the moment she left his office. But Elena Morales, standing in that alley with a crumpled piece of paper in her pocket, was about to become the biggest mistake Arthur Sterling ever made. Elena sat on the crosstown bus, the plastic bag on her lap, Leo's photograph clutched in her hand. Through the streaked, dirty window, she watched the city pass by, but it no longer looked like the place where she had lived for decades. The towering buildings, once symbols of opportunity and American promise, now looked like monuments to a game she was never allowed to play. The bright storefront displays she passed, jewelry stores, luxury boutiques, restaurants where a single meal cost what she used to make in a week, felt like exhibits in a museum of a world that existed only for other people. The bus was nearly empty at this hour. A tired nurse, still in scrubs, dozed in the back. A young man with headphones stared at his phone screen, his face illuminated by its glow. An elderly woman with 3 shopping bags from a discount store sat across the aisle from Elena, her weathered face a mirror of exhaustion. They were the people of the night shift, the invisible workers who kept the city running while the powerful slept in their comfortable beds. None of them knew that Elena's life had just ended. When she arrived at the small apartment she shared with Sophia and Leo, it was nearly 3 in the morning. She had hoped they would be asleep, that she could slip in quietly and have the night to figure out what to say, how to explain the unexplainable. But Sophia was awake, sitting at their small kitchen table, working through a pile of medical bills by the light of a lamp. Her daughter looked up as Elena entered, and immediately her expression shifted from tired concentration to alarm. "Mama, what are you doing home so early? It's not even 3:30. Did something happen?" Elena couldn't speak. The words were there. I was fired, 3 simple words, but they refused to leave her throat. Instead, she just stood there, still holding the plastic bag, still gripping Leo's photograph, and the tears she had been holding back for hours finally broke free. "Mama!" Sophia rushed to her, wrapping her arms around her mother. "Mama, what happened? Are you hurt? Please tell me what's wrong." "I lost my job," Elena finally managed to say, her voice broken and small. "I was fired tonight. There was an accident. A frame. It moved. I left a smudge. Mr. Sterling, he said I was fired. Just like that. 10 years, Sophia. 10 years, and it was over in 5 minutes. Sophia pulled back, her face pale. For a moment she said nothing, just stared at her mother as the implications of those words settled over them both like a suffocating blanket. "Mama," Sophia whispered, "Leo's medication." "I know. The rent. I know. What are we going to do?" And Elena had no answer. For the first time in her daughter's life, Elena Morales had no answer. The weeks that followed were a descent into a quiet, gray hell. Elena applied for unemployment benefits, but the process was Byzantine. Endless forms, phone calls that led to automated menus that led to more phone calls. She was told she needed documentation. She needed proof of termination. She needed to attend a mandatory orientation. The earliest available appointment was in 3 weeks. She applied for jobs, dozens of them. Every cleaning company, every janitorial service, every hotel and office building. She filled out applications with increasing desperation, her careful handwriting becoming more frantic with each rejection. The responses, when they came at all, were variations on a theme. "We've decided to pursue other candidates. Your qualifications don't match our current needs. The position has been filled." And sometimes the brutal honesty, "We're looking for someone with more flexibility." Code for someone younger. "You're overqualified for this position." Code for "You're too old. We need someone who can work weekends and holidays." As if she hadn't worked every weekend and holiday for a decade. At 58, with her experience limited to manual labor, with no degree and no technical skills, Elena Morales was obsolete. The economy had moved on without her, and there was no place left for women like her. The pharmacy bills piled up. Mr. Henderson, bless him, extended her credit once, then twice, his kind face growing more pained each time Elena came in. "I'm so sorry, Elena. If it were up to me, I would just give you the medication. But the system, the insurance, the corporate policies, my hands are tied." Leo's inhaler ran out on a Tuesday. For 3 days, they rationed what little was left, cutting his doses in half, then in thirds. His breathing grew labored. His lips took on a faint blue tinge that made Elena's heart stop every time she saw it. He stopped running, stopped playing with his friends. He spent his evenings sitting quietly on the couch, drawing pictures with crayons, each breath a conscious effort. Sophia picked up extra shifts, working 16-hour days, her face growing gaunt and her eyes hollow. She stopped smiling, she stopped sleeping. She became a ghost in her own life, existing only to work and worry. The eviction notice arrived on a Friday, a bright red paper taped to their door like a scarlet letter. They were 3 months behind on rent now. Mrs. Chen, their landlord, had been patient beyond reason, but even her kindness had limits. They had 30 days to pay the full amount or vacate the premises. One evening, after Elena had spent another fruitless day applying for jobs, she came home to find Sophia sobbing quietly at the kitchen table, her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking with the force of her grief. "Mama," Sophia whispered when she could finally speak, "I don't know what we're going to do. I picked up another shift at the restaurant. I'm working doubles 6 days a week now, but it's not enough." "It's never enough. The medication, the rent, the food. The numbers don't work. They don't work." Elena sat beside her daughter and held her while she cried. Sophia, her strong, resilient daughter who had never complained about single motherhood, who had worked 2 jobs without resentment, who had faced every hardship with grace, Sophia was breaking. And Elena was powerless to stop it. Seeing her daughter so broken was a pain sharper than any of her own. That night, after Sophia had cried herself into exhausted sleep on the couch, and Leo was in bed, his breathing a worrying wheeze even in sleep, Elena sat alone at the kitchen table. The apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the old refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. She felt empty, hollowed out, a shell of a person going through the motions of existence. She thought about Arthur Sterling in his tower of glass and steel, probably sleeping peacefully in his mansion, his conscience untroubled by the lives he had destroyed. To him, she had been an imperfection to be erased, a smudge to be wiped clean. He had forgotten her the moment she left his office. But she was not a smudge. She was a human being. She was a mother, a grandmother, a widow. She had dignity and worth and value, regardless of what that monster believed. Elena stood and walked to the small closet by the front door where she kept her coats. She reached into the pocket of her old work coat, searching for something, she wasn't sure what. Maybe a forgotten dollar bill that could buy Leo one more day of medication. Maybe a bus token that could take her to one more job interview. Maybe just a tissue to wipe her tears. Her fingers found a crumpled tissue, a handful of coins that amounted to 37 cents, and the wadded-up ball of paper from Sterling's office, the one she had taken in that moment of pointless rebellion. It felt like a lifetime ago. That night, the night her life had ended, was only 3 weeks past, but it existed in a different universe. A universe where she still had hope. She was about to throw the paper ball into the trash, a final severing of her ties to Sterling Tower and everything it represented, but something made her stop. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was just the need to think about anything other than her impossible situation for a few minutes. She sat back down at the kitchen table and carefully began to smooth out the crumpled paper. It took several minutes. Sterling had compressed it with such force that the creases were deep and stubborn. But gradually, the paper revealed itself. It was a computer printout, standard white paper, the kind that came from an office printer. No letterhead, no company logo, just text. But what text it was! At the top, in small print, was a header. Nightingale Admin Contingency Key, generated 03-15-2025 for emergency access only. Below that was a dense, complex string of letters, numbers, and symbols. It looked like gibberish at first, random chaos. But as Elena stared at it, she recognized a structure. It was a password, a very long, very complex password. And she remembered the name, Nightingale. She had seen it once, maybe 2 years ago, when Sterling had held a late-night meeting in his office with his inner circle. They had been talking about uploading the quarterly reports to Nightingale and securing the Nightingale server. She had been dusting in the corner, invisible as always, but her mind had caught the name because it seemed so oddly poetic for Arthur Sterling, a man with no poetry in his soul to choose. A nightingale, a bird known for its beautiful song. What was Arthur Sterling's nightingale? Elena stared at the paper for a long time. A dangerous thought was forming in her mind, a thought that went against every principle her husband had taught her, every value she had tried to instill in Sophia. But desperation is a powerful alchemist. It can transform fear into recklessness, caution into daring, and morality into a luxury one can no longer afford. Could this password be useful? The thought terrified her. She was not a criminal. She had never stolen anything in her life, beyond maybe an extra sugar packet from a coffee shop. The idea of using Sterling's password, of accessing something that wasn't hers, made her physically ill. But then she thought of Leo's blue lips, of Sophia's hollow eyes, of the red eviction notice on their door, of Sterling's cold voice saying, "The weak suffer and fade away." Elena folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her pocket. The next day, she went to the public library. The Riverside Public Library was a warm, welcoming place, a refuge for the homeless seeking shelter from the cold, for students doing homework, for job seekers like Elena using the free computers and internet. It smelled of old books and floor cleaner and humanity. Elena had always loved libraries, the democratic beauty of them, places where everyone, regardless of wealth or status, had equal access to knowledge and opportunity. She sat at one of the public computer terminals and just stared at the screen. Her hands were shaking. Her heart was pounding. The paper with the password was in her pocket, and it felt like it was burning a hole through the fabric. What was she thinking? She couldn't do this. This was wrong. This was illegal. She could go to prison. And then what would happen to Leo, to Sophia? But what would happen to them if she did nothing? Leo would die slowly, gasping for air. They would be evicted. Sophia would work herself into an early grave trying to keep them afloat. The end result was the same: destruction. At least this way, maybe. Could what? What did she even think she could do with a password? Even if it worked, even if she could access Sterling's files, then what? She wasn't a hacker. She wasn't a spy. She was just a 58-year-old woman who cleaned floors for a living. She left the library without touching the keyboard. But she came back the next day, and the day after that. Each time, she sat at a computer, stared at the blank screen, and left without doing anything. The paper in her pocket felt heavier each time. On the fourth day, she saw a news story on one of the library's television monitors. The headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen read, "Sterling Corp announces record profits. CEO Arthur Sterling praises efficient operations and streamlined workforce." The screen showed footage of Sterling at a press conference, standing at a podium with the Sterling Corp logo behind him, smiling that cold, predatory smile. "We've eliminated redundancies and inefficiencies across all departments," he was saying. "This company doesn't carry dead weight. We reward excellence and eliminate mediocrity. That's how we've achieved these remarkable results." Eliminated redundancies, dead weight, mediocrity. Elena understood with perfect clarity that he was talking about people like her. To Arthur Sterling, she and everyone like her were not human beings with lives and families and dreams. They were line items on a spreadsheet, costs to be cut, inefficiencies to be eliminated. That night, Elena went to the library with a sense of grim purpose. She chose a computer in the furthest, most secluded corner of the building, partially hidden behind a row of reference shelves. She sat down, took a deep breath, and pulled the crumpled paper from her pocket. Her hands were clammy. My mouth was dry. But my hands were steady as I opened a web browser. She typed in the web address she remembered seeing on Sterling's office whiteboard, nightingale.sterlingcorp.internal. The browser loaded for a moment, then displayed an error. Cannot reach site. Of course, it was an internal server, not accessible from outside the company network. She tried variations. Nightingale.sterlingcorp.com, nothing. sterlingcorp.com/Nightingale, nothing. She was about to give up when she remembered something else. She had once overheard an IT technician talking to a junior executive about VPN access and external portals. Sterling Corp must have a way for executives to access their servers from home or while traveling. She searched for Sterling Corp Remote Access and found a login portal, remote.sterlingcorp.com. The page loaded, a sleek corporate interface, all blacks and silver, very on brand for Sterling. At the top, bold letters declared, "Sterling Corp, authorized access only." Below that were two fields, username and password. And below those, a drop-down menu labeled Connect to with several options. One of them was Nightingale Secure Server. Elena's heart began to race. This was real. This was actually real. She selected Nightingale Secure Server from the drop-down. The page refreshed slightly, adding a new line of text. Administrative access required. Emergency contingency protocol. The password was on the paper in her hand, but the username... I had no idea what the username could be. She tried the obvious ones first. A. Sterling. Access denied. Arthur Sterling. Access denied. Sterling. Access denied. Administrator. Access denied. Administrator. Access denied. Elena sat back, defeated. Of course it wouldn't be that simple. Sterling was paranoid about security. The username would be something obscure, something only he would know. She looked at the paper again, studying every detail. At the top, that header, Nightingale_admin_contingency key. Contingency, an emergency backup, a failsafe. If this was an emergency access password, perhaps it didn't need a normal username. Perhaps the username itself was part of the contingency protocol. She thought about Arthur Sterling, about his ego, his arrogance, his absolute certainty in his own superiority. What would a man like that choose as his emergency username? Something that reflected his self-image, something that embodied how he saw himself. Master, king, god, apex. She typed master into the username field. Then she began the painstaking process of typing the password from the paper. It was absurdly long, a mix of uppercase and lowercase letters, numbers, and special symbols. NVS7PQ2NMK9RL at 3XZ6HW*1F8DY. It took her 3 tries. She kept making mistakes, losing her place, but finally she had it entered exactly as it appeared on the paper. Her finger hovered over the enter key. This was it, the point of no return. If she pressed this key, she would be committing a crime, computer fraud, unauthorized access. She could go to prison. But if she didn't press it, Leo would die. Slowly, gasping for air, looking at her with those trusting eyes, wondering why his abuela couldn't save him. Elena thought of Arthur Sterling's words, "The weak suffer and fade away." She thought of her husband, Roberto, killed by Sterling's cost-cutting measures. She thought of Leo's blue lips. She closed her eyes and pressed enter. Elena's eyes snapped open. The screen had changed. The login portal had vanished, replaced by a file directory. At the top, in the same corporate font, Nightingale's Secure Server. Welcome, Master. Last login 03-15-2025, 11:47 p.m. She was in. For a moment, Elena just sat there, stunned. She had expected failure. She had expected error messages and locked doors. But instead, she was staring at the digital heart of Arthur Sterling's empire. The main directory showed dozens of folders with cryptic, ominous names. Riverwood _H2 analysis. Phoenix Fund _acquisitions. Cayman _alpha ledger. Union matter resolved. Regulatory capture matrix. Hostile takeover protocols. Offshore structure 2024. Competitor surveillance. Political contributions tracking. Elena's hands trembled as she moved the mouse cursor over the folder names. This wasn't just a file server. This was Sterling's secret vault, his hidden ledger, the place where he kept the truths too ugly for the public eye. She clicked on the first folder that caught her attention, Riverwood. Inside were hundreds of files, geological surveys, chemical analysis reports, internal memos, a folder labeled Legal Exposure Assessment, another labeled Cost-Benefit Analysis. Elena began to read. It took hours. The documents were dense, full of scientific jargon and corporate doublespeak. But Elena was patient, and she had nothing but time. She used Google to look up unfamiliar terms, she cross-referenced documents, she built a picture, piece by piece. And when that picture finally emerged in its complete, horrifying clarity, Elena felt physically ill. Project Riverwood was not a development initiative. It was not an investment in a struggling town. It was a criminal conspiracy. Sterling Corp owned a chemical manufacturing facility in northern Ohio. For years, that facility had been producing industrial waste, highly toxic compounds including lead, arsenic, and several known carcinogens. The proper disposal of such waste was expensive, requiring specialized treatment facilities and strict regulatory oversight. So Sterling had found a cheaper solution. Through a shell company that was 7 layers removed from Sterling Corp, they had purchased a defunct industrial site in Riverwood, a poor, rural town with a population of just under 8,000. The site sat directly above the town's groundwater aquifer, the source of drinking water for the entire community. The plan was simple and monstrous. Pump the toxic waste into the abandoned facility's underground storage tanks, let it slowly leach into the groundwater, and walk away. The contamination would take years to be detected. By then, the shell company would be dissolved, the paper trail would be cold, and Sterling Corp would be untouchable. One memo, written by Sterling's chief legal counsel, laid out the mathematics of murder with chilling precision. Projected contamination will result in elevated cancer rates, 30 to 35% increase. Developmental disorders in children, 25% increase. Estimated legal exposure if traced to Sterling Corp, 400 to 600 million in settlements. Estimated cost of proper disposal, 890 million. Recommendation: proceed with current plan. The cost-benefit analysis strongly favors controlled contamination over compliant disposal. They had calculated the cost of human suffering and found it acceptable. Elena read testimonials from the company's own environmental consultants, experts who had been paid handsomely to raise concerns and then paid even more handsomely to ignore them. The leach rate into the aquifer will be approximately 200 gallons per day of Class 1 hazardous material. This concentration level is 40 times above EPA safety standards. Children and elderly will be most severely affected. I strongly advise against this course of action. That consultant had been fired 2 days after submitting his report. His replacement wrote, "Upon review, the proposed disposal method falls within acceptable risk parameters." There were emails from Sterling himself. One, sent to his operations director, was brief and brutal. Riverwood is an economically depressed area with minimal political influence. The population is largely uneducated and lacks the resources to mount effective legal challenges. Proceed as planned. If issues arise, we'll settle quietly and individually. Divide and conquer. They can't afford the lawyers, we can. Another email, this one to his PR team, was even more chilling. If this becomes public, our position is simple. We had no knowledge of the subcontractor's disposal methods. We are shocked and appalled. We will cooperate fully with investigations, while our lawyers ensure maximum delays and minimal liability. Budget $10 million for a charity donation to the affected community after sufficient time has passed. Turn the crisis into a redemption narrative. Elena sat back from the computer, her hands shaking. She felt like she couldn't breathe. The fluorescent lights of the library suddenly felt too bright, the air too thick. Arthur Sterling wasn't just a ruthless businessman. He was a murderer. He was poisoning an entire town, thousands of people, hundreds of children, because it was cheaper than following the law. And he was getting away with it. She looked around the library. An elderly man dozed in a chair with a newspaper on his lap. A teenager studying at a nearby table. A mother read a picture book to her toddler in the children's section. Normal people, innocent people, the kind of people who lived in towns like Riverwood. People who trusted that the water coming from their taps was safe to drink. People who believed that the law protected them from monsters. Elena thought of Leo drinking water from his glass at dinner, trusting that it wouldn't kill him. She thought of all the Leos in Riverwood, all the grandmothers like her, all the families just trying to survive. The rage that rose in her was unlike anything she had ever felt. It wasn't hot and explosive. It was cold and clear and absolutely unshakable. She couldn't unsee what she had seen. She couldn't unknow what she now knew. Going to the police was pointless. She understood that instinctively. Sterling owns the police, or rather, he owned the people who controlled the police. The Riverwood files contained a document labeled Political Insurance that listed generous campaign contributions to the county sheriff, the district attorney, 2 state senators, and a federal judge. The system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as Sterling had designed it to function. Elena looked back at the computer screen, at the list of folders. Riverwood was just one. What horrors were hidden in the others? She clicked on Phoenix Fund _acquisitions. The Phoenix Fund was Sterling's masterpiece of corporate predation. It was a systematic operation for destroying innovative startups and stealing their technology. The process was documented in nauseating detail. Step 1. Identification. Sterling's team monitored patent filings, tech publications, and startup accelerators to identify promising young companies with breakthrough technologies. Step 2. Infiltration. Sterling Corp would hire away key employees from the target company, not because they needed those employees, but to gather intelligence. They would invest in competing startups to gain access to industry gossip and insider information. Step 3. Theft. Using the intelligence gathered, Sterling's engineers would reverse engineer the target's technology, making just enough modifications to avoid patent infringement. Or so their lawyers claimed. Step 4. Assault. Sterling Corp would launch a competing product, using their massive marketing budget and market dominance to undercut the startup's price and flood the market. Step 5. Acquisition. Once the startup was on the verge of bankruptcy, Sterling would purchase it for pennies on the dollar, absorbing any patents or technologies they hadn't already stolen. The folder contained a list of victims, 47 companies over the past 8 years. Each entry included the company name, the founders' names, the technology stolen, and the final acquisition price. Elena recognized some of the names from news stories she had read over the years. Promising startup closes doors after funding dries up. Tech darlings fail to gain market traction. The stories always painted the failures as market realities, Darwinistic capitalism at work. But these weren't failures. They were murders. One entry caught Elena's eye. Solstice Innovations, solar panel and battery technology. Est market disruption if successful, 50 billion plus. Current status, pre-acquisition phase, launch assault, Q2 2025. Solstice Innovations was still alive, still fighting, still unaware that Arthur Sterling had already decided their fate. Elena took a deep breath and clicked on the next folder, Cayman _Alpha Ledger. This was the money, the secret heart of Sterling's financial empire. The folder contained spreadsheets, hundreds of them, tracking money through a dizzying labyrinth of offshore accounts, shell corporations, and international transfers. It took Elena's untrained eye hours to make sense of the structure, but the pattern eventually became clear. Sterling Corp's official, public financial statements showed healthy but reasonable profits. The company paid taxes, though of course they took every deduction and credit available. It all looked legitimate. But that was a fiction, a carefully constructed facade. The real money, billions of dollars, flowed through this hidden network. Profits were transferred to shell companies in the Cayman Islands, then moved to Ireland, then to Luxembourg, then to Panama. Each transfer carefully structured to avoid taxes and scrutiny. And then there were the bribes. One spreadsheet, labeled Political Investment Portfolio, listed payments to politicians and officials. 1. Senator James Whitmore, ROH, $500,000, killed EPA oversight expansion bill. 2. Commissioner Lisa Hartley, State Environmental, $75,000, expedited Riverwood permits. 3. Judge Martin Cross, Federal Circuit, $200,000, favorable ruling on patent case. 4. Attorney General candidate David Shaw, $1 million. Funding through PAC, Future Insurance. The list went on. Dozens of names, hundreds of payments, a network of corruption that ran through every level of government. Sterling hadn't conquered the system. He had purchased it. Elena sat in that library chair, illuminated by the cold glow of the computer screen, and felt the full weight of what she had discovered. This wasn't just evidence of corporate malfeasance. This was a map of systemic evil. This was proof that the world was exactly as dark and rigged as the most cynical person could imagine. And she, Elena, the invisible woman, the cleaning lady who didn't matter, was the only person in the world who had access to it. She checked the time. It was nearly midnight. She had been at the library for 6 hours. The building would close soon. Elena knew she couldn't keep coming back to this public computer. It was too risky. Eventually, Sterling's security team, and she knew from the files that his head of security was a former military intelligence officer named Marcus Jensen, would detect the unauthorized access and trace it. She needed to download everything, to save it somewhere safe. But how much data was here? She did a quick check. Over a terabyte. Far too much to put on a USB drive, and she didn't have cloud storage. Then she remembered. The library offered a service for job seekers. They would help you create email accounts, set up basic file storage, and learn basic computer skills. She had used it once, a year ago, when she was trying to apply for jobs online. They had helped her set up a free email account. Elena quickly created a new email account using a false name, Maria Veritas. She chose Veritas because it was the only Latin word she knew. Her husband had taught it to her once, telling her it meant truth. Then she began the methodical process of copying files. She couldn't get everything, there was too much, but she could get the most damning evidence. The Riverwood files, the Phoenix Fund records, the Cayman ledgers, the political bribery spreadsheets. She compressed them into zip files and emailed them to herself, sending batch after batch. It took over an hour. By the time she was finished, her new email account contained enough evidence to destroy Arthur Sterling 10 times over. Elena cleared the computer's browser history, deleted the cache, and logged out. She stood up on shaking legs, gathered her things, and walked out of the library into the cold night air. The city felt different now. Or perhaps Elena felt different. She was no longer just a victim, helpless and erased. She was something new, something dangerous. She was a woman with a weapon. The question was, what would she do with it? Elena Morales did not sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed in the small apartment she shared with Sophia and Leo, staring at the water-stained ceiling, her mind racing. The glow of the streetlight outside filtered through the thin curtains, casting shifting shadows as cars passed below. In the next room, she could hear Leo's labored breathing, that terrible wheeze that never quite went away anymore. His medication would run out in 4 days. The weight of what she had discovered pressed down on her like a physical force. In her email account, accessible from any computer, any phone, anywhere in the world, was information that could topple an empire. Evidence of crimes that could send Arthur Sterling to prison for life. But evidence alone wasn't enough. She understood that with cold clarity. Sterling had money, billions of dollars. He had lawyers, armies of them, the best that money could buy. He had political connections, media connections, connections that reached into every corner of power. If she simply went to the police with her evidence, what would happen? They would investigate, certainly, but Sterling's lawyers would tie the case up in court for years. His political allies would pressure the prosecutors. His media connections would paint Elena as a disgruntled employee with an axe to grind, possibly mentally unstable, possibly a criminal herself for accessing his private files. And while the legal machinery ground slowly forward, Sterling would have all the time in the world to destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, and make Elena disappear, either literally or through character assassination so thorough that no one would ever believe her again. No, simply having the evidence wasn't enough. She needed to be strategic, surgical. She needed to use the information in a way that Sterling couldn't counter, couldn't suppress, couldn't buy his way out of. She needed to become invisible again, but this time, invisibility would be her weapon, not her prison. The next morning, Elena took the bus to a big box electronics store on the edge of the city. She had $67 in her bank account, money she desperately needed for food, but she needed tools more than she needed dinner. She bought the cheapest laptop she could find, a refurbished model, 3 years old, with a cracked case and a dim screen. It cost $49. She also bought a prepaid mobile Wi-Fi hotspot with 1 month of data, $15. That left her with $3. She brought her purchases home and set up her new command center on the small desk in her bedroom. Really just a card table with a drawer, but it was hers. She opened the laptop, connected to her Wi-Fi hotspot, and logged into her Maria Veritas email account. The files were all there, waiting. Gigabytes of proof of Arthur Sterling's crimes. Elena spent the next 2 days reading everything. She took notes by hand in a spiral notebook, filling page after page with details. She organized the information, creating a mental map of Sterling's empire, understanding not just what he had done, but how all the pieces connected to each other. Riverwood wasn't just a crime in itself. It was connected to the political bribes. Sterling had paid off the environmental commissioner to fast-track the permits. The Phoenix Fund thefts weren't just corporate espionage. They were funded by the offshore money flowing through the Cayman accounts. Everything was interconnected, a web of corruption with Arthur Sterling at the center. And Elena began to see the pattern of his thinking. Sterling believed he was untouchable because he was too big, too powerful, too essential to the economy. His empire was a house of cards, but it was such a massive, complex house that everyone was afraid to pull a single card for fear the whole structure would collapse and destroy everything around it. So Elena decided she would pull not one card, but all of them, systematically. One by one. But she couldn't do it alone. She needed an amplifier, a way to get the information to the public in a manner that couldn't be suppressed or ignored. She needed a journalist. Elena researched. For days, she read online news sites, investigated reporters, studied their backgrounds. She needed 3 specific qualities. First, they had to be brave. Really brave, willing to take on a billionaire and face the inevitable legal threats and professional risks. Second, they had to be competent, a good reporter who would verify the information, build a proper case, and publish a story that could withstand legal scrutiny. Third, they had to be independent. No major corporate news outlets. Sterling probably had connections there, could pressure editors and publishers. She needed someone from a smaller, independent publication, someone who couldn't be easily intimidated or bought. After a week of research, Elena settled on David Chen. David Chen was a reporter for The Sentinel, an independent online news publication that specialized in investigative journalism. The Sentinel was small, maybe a dozen full-time staff, but they had a reputation for fearless reporting. They had broken several major corruption scandals in the past few years. They had been sued multiple times and had won every case. But what really convinced Elena was a profile piece I found about David Chen himself. He had grown up in a working-class neighborhood in San Francisco, the son of immigrants who ran a small grocery store. His father had been forced out of business by a corporate chain that had used predatory pricing to destroy local competitors, then raised prices once the competition was eliminated. David Chen had become a journalist, he said in the interview, because I watched my parents get destroyed by people who had all the power and none of the conscience. Someone needs to tell the stories of the people who get crushed by the machine. He was 34 years old. He had won 2 regional journalism awards. He had a reputation for protecting his sources no matter what. And, Elena noted with grim satisfaction, he had written 3 critical pieces about Sterling Corp over the past year, articles about labor practices, environmental violations, and tax avoidance. Nothing major enough to hurt Sterling, but enough to show that David Chen wasn't afraid of him. Yes, David Chen was the one. But Elena couldn't just trust him blindly. She needed to test him first. She searched through the files for something significant but disposable, a crime serious enough to make news, but not so important that it would tip her hand too early, a single branch from the poisoned tree, not the whole forest. She found it in a folder labeled Municipal Acquisitions Infrastructure. Robert Miller, a city councilman from District 7, had received $100,000 from a Sterling shell company called Urban Development Solutions, LLC. In exchange, Councilman Miller had voted to approve a controversial waterfront development that would have normally faced serious environmental and community opposition. The payment was carefully documented: bank transfer records, emails discussing consulting fees, and a particularly damning text message where Miller wrote to a Sterling executive, "Deal is done. Make sure my payment clears before the end of the month." It was a clear-cut bribery case, serious enough to ruin Miller's career and generate significant press. But it was also relatively isolated. It didn't directly connect to Riverwood or the larger crimes. If Sterling's lawyers tried to suppress it, the rest of Elena's evidence would remain safe. Perfect. Elena created a new, heavily encrypted email account. She spent hours researching how to do this properly, using a VPN service to hide her location, routing her connection through multiple international servers, using anonymous registration. She wasn't an expert, but desperation made her a quick study. Her new email address was veritaswitness@protonmail.com. She composed a message to David Chen. Mr. Chen, you don't know me. You don't need to know me. What you need to know is that I have evidence of corruption at the highest levels of Sterling Corp. I am not a competitor. I am not a disgruntled employee with an axe to grind. I am simply someone who has seen too much to stay silent. Attached to this email is proof that City Councilman Robert Miller accepted a $100,000 bribe from a Sterling shell company in exchange for his vote on the Harbor Point waterfront development. The documents are genuine. You will be able to verify their authenticity. If you are the journalist your reputation suggests, you will know what to do with this information. If you publish this story, and if you protect your source, know that this is only the beginning. There is a cancer in this city, and I have the X-rays. I will be watching. Veritas. Elena attached the files: bank records, emails, text messages, corporate registration documents linking Urban Development Solutions, LLC to Sterling Corp. Everything a good journalist would need to build an airtight case. Her finger hovered over the send button. This was another point of no return. Once she sent this email, she would be initiating a war against one of the most powerful men in the world. There would be no going back. She thought of Leo. She thought of the people of Riverwood. She thought of the 47 companies Sterling had destroyed. She thought of her husband, Roberto, killed by Sterling's cost-cutting. She clicked send. The email disappeared into the digital ether. Elena closed her laptop, her hands shaking. Now came the hardest part, waiting. The next 4 days were the longest of Elena's life. Every passing siren made her jump. Every car that slowed near her building made her heart race. Every person who looked at her twice on the bus seemed like a threat. Had she made a catastrophic mistake? Was David Chen, at this very moment, on the phone with Sterling's lawyers, cutting a deal in exchange for information about his mysterious source? Would Elena wake up to find federal agents at her door? She went about her life in a fog of anxiety. She attended a job interview at a hotel. She didn't get it. She stood in line at a food bank to get supplies for dinner. The volunteers were kind, but the experience was humiliating. She sat with Leo and helped him with his homework, trying to smile when every breath he took sounded like a struggle. Sophia watched her with worried eyes. "Mama, are you okay? You seem different, distant." "I am fine, mija," Elena lied. "Just tired, just worried about finding work." But Sophia knew her mother too well. "It's more than that. You're scared. What's wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," Elena insisted. "Everything will be okay, I promise." It was a promise she had no right to make, but it was the only thing she could offer. On the 4th day, Elena was in the university library. She had started alternating between different libraries and coffee shops, never staying in one place too long, when her phone buzzed with a news alert. She clicked the link with trembling fingers. The headline was from the Sentinel. "Councilman Miller caught in bribery scandal. Leaked documents tie him to Sterling Corp." Elena read the article with her heart pounding. It was brilliant. David Chen hadn't just published her documents, he had used them as a starting point for a full investigation. He had interviewed former city employees who confirmed Miller's suspicious behavior during the Harbor Point vote. He had found a whistleblower from the construction company who testified that Miller had been promised additional kickbacks. He had traced the money through the shell company structure and definitively linked it to Sterling Corp. The article was thorough, damning, and legally bulletproof. And at the very end, in a short paragraph, Chen had written, "The documents at the center of this investigation were provided by a confidential source, a concerned citizen who wishes to remain anonymous, and whom the Sentinel will identify only by the codename Veritas. The Sentinel has independently verified the authenticity of all documents and stands behind this reporting completely." Elena felt tears prick her eyes. He had protected her. He had used the codename she had given herself. He had taken her seriously. She quickly checked other news sites. The story was already spreading. Local news stations were picking it up. National outlets were starting to take notice. By evening, video footage of Councilman Miller's house surrounded by news vans was playing on every channel. Miller held a brief, disastrous press conference where he claimed the documents were fabricated and part of a political smear campaign. But his denials were weak and unconvincing. His own party was already distancing itself from him. The district attorney announced an investigation. The FBI said they would review the matter. It was beautiful chaos, and Arthur Sterling, for the first time in years, was on the defensive. Elena checked Sterling Corp's official response, posted on their website. "Sterling Corp is shocked and disappointed by the allegations involving Mr. Miller. We have strict policies against bribery and corruption. Urban Development Solutions LLC was a contractor whose actions we were unaware of. We are cooperating fully with all investigations. It was exactly the response Elena had expected. Deny, deflect, claim ignorance. Sterling's lawyers were already building their defense. But Elena wasn't worried, because she knew something Sterling didn't. This was just the opening move. The real battle hadn't even begun. That evening, she sent a second email to David Chen. Mr. Chen, you passed the test. Your reporting on the Miller case was excellent, thorough, fearless, and fair. You protected your source. You did everything right. Are you ready for more? What I sent you about Councilman Miller was one drop of water from an ocean of corruption. I have evidence of crimes that make the Miller bribery look like a parking ticket. Environmental crimes, corporate espionage, political corruption that reaches into the highest levels of state and federal government. But I need to know you're ready. What's coming next will make powerful people very, very angry. They will threaten you. They will try to destroy you. They will use every legal weapon they have to silence you. Are you brave enough? Are you strong enough? If you are, respond to this email with a single word: ready. If you're not, I understand. Walk away now. Forget you ever heard from me. Veritas. She sent the message and waited. She didn't have to wait long. 15 minutes later, a response appeared in her inbox. Elena opened it, her breath caught in her throat. It contained one word: ready. Elena allowed herself a small, grim smile. She had her weapon. She had her amplifier. Now it was time to plan the attack. Elena spent the next week planning her campaign with the meticulousness of a general preparing for battle. She organized Sterling's crimes into categories, ranking them by severity and public impact. She created a strategic sequence. Each story would build on the last. Each revelation would make the next one more credible. She would not simply destroy Arthur Sterling. She would dismantle him piece by piece, methodically and publicly, until there was nothing left. She decided on a 3-phase approach. Phase 1, the heart. She would expose Riverwood, show the world who Arthur Sterling really was, not a brilliant businessman, but a monster who poisoned children for profit. This would create public outrage, moral authority, and political pressure that even Sterling's lawyers couldn't deflect. Phase 2, the mind. While Sterling was reeling from the Riverwood revelations, she would release the Phoenix Fund files. Show the world that his success wasn't built on innovation or hard work. It was built on theft and predation. This would destroy his professional reputation and turn his business allies against him. Phase 3, the soul. Finally, when Sterling was weakened and desperate, she would deliver the killing blow. She had found that evidence in a file she had been afraid to open, a file labeled Union Matter Resolved. Elena had saved it for last because she knew, instinctively, that what was inside would be the worst thing she had seen yet. And she was right. Frank Costello had been a union organizer at a Sterling-owned manufacturing plant in Pennsylvania. He was charismatic, effective, and beloved by the workers. He had successfully organized a union vote and had been negotiating for better wages, safer working conditions, and health benefits. Arthur Sterling had seen him as a threat, not just to his profit margins, but to his philosophy. If workers at one plant could organize and win concessions, workers at other plants might try the same. The infection of worker empowerment might spread through his entire empire. So Sterling had resolved the matter. The file contained financial records showing a payment of $200,000 to an offshore account belonging to someone named Victor Krasny, a name that Elena Googled and immediately wished she hadn't. Victor Krasny was a known criminal, a former enforcer for Eastern European organized crime, now working as a freelance problem solver for people with money and no conscience. 3 weeks after the payment cleared, Frank Costello had been found dead in his car, parked in an empty lot near the manufacturing plant. The official cause of death was carbon monoxide poisoning, an apparent suicide. The police investigation was cursory. Case closed. But the file contained an email exchange between Sterling and Marcus Jensen, his head of security. The emails were brief, coded, but unmistakable in their meaning. Sterling: the union situation is becoming untenable. It needs to be resolved permanently. Jensen: understood. I have a contact who specializes in permanent resolutions. Estimated cost, $200,000. Timeline, 3 weeks. No connections. Sterling: approved. Make sure it looks natural. And Jensen: this conversation never happened. Jensen: understood. 3 weeks later, Frank Costello was dead. The union effort collapsed without its leader. The workers, frightened and demoralized. Elena sat in a coffee shop, her laptop open, staring at those emails. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to put down her coffee before she spilled it. This was murder. Premeditated, calculated murder. Not through negligence or cost-cutting, like her husband's death. This was Sterling, ordering a man's assassination as casually as someone might order lunch. And Elena had the proof. She closed her laptop and looked around the coffee shop. A young couple laughed at a nearby table. A student typed on her laptop, headphones in, oblivious to the world. A father helped his toddler daughter with a chocolate muffin, patiently wiping frosting from her face. Normal people, living normal lives. They had no idea that people like Arthur Sterling existed, people who could order another human being's death and then sleep peacefully that night. But they were about to find out. Elena began with Riverwood, just as she had planned. She sent David Chen the complete file, all the geological surveys, all the chemical analyses, all the internal memos, all the cost-benefit calculations that valued human life in dollars and cents. She included specific instructions. Mr. Chen: this is not a story you can tell from behind a desk. You need to go to Riverwood. You need to meet the people. Talk to the mothers whose children are getting sick. Talk to the elderly whose well water smells like chemicals. Talk to the town doctor who's seeing cancer rates spike but doesn't have the resources to investigate why. The documents tell you what Sterling did, but the people of Riverwood will tell you what it means. This is the story that will change everything. Veritas. David Chen flew to Riverwood, Ohio, the next day. He spent a week there, and when he returned, he wrote something that transcended journalism and became art. A piece that was equal parts investigation, human interest story, and moral indictment. The article was titled, "The Town That Sterling Poisoned." It opened with the story of Emma Harrison, a 7-year-old girl with leukemia. Her mother, Jennifer, had no idea why her healthy, active daughter had suddenly become sick. The doctors couldn't explain it. It seemed like terrible, random bad luck. Until David Chen showed Jennifer the documents. Until he explained that her well water had been contaminated with carcinogens for years. until he told her that Arthur Sterling had known this would happen and had decided it was acceptable. Chen's article included Jennifer's reaction, her disbelief turning to horror, her horror turning to rage, her rage turning to tears as she realized her daughter's illness wasn't an act of God or fate. It was a crime, a calculated, deliberate crime. The article included interviews with a dozen families, children with developmental disabilities, elderly residents with liver disease, young adults with rare cancers. And in every case, Chen drew the connection back to Sterling Corp., back to the contaminated water, back to the decision, documented in Sterling's own files, to poison these people because it was cheaper than following the law. Chen included photographs: Emma Harrison's bald head from chemotherapy, an elderly farmer holding a jar of his well water, which had an oily yellow tint, a graph showing cancer rates in Riverwood compared to surrounding towns, a spike so dramatic it looked like a mountain rising from a plain. And Chen included excerpts from the documents. The cold, clinical language of Sterling's memos contrasted with the human suffering they had caused. From Sterling Corp. Memo: estimated legal exposure if traced to Sterling Corp., $200 to $400 million in settlements and fines. Estimated cost of proper disposal, $890 million. Recommendation: proceed with current plan. From Jennifer Harrison interview: my daughter asked me yesterday why she doesn't have hair anymore. She's 7. How do I explain to a 7-year-old that someone decided her life was worth less than $400 million? The article ended with a simple, devastating question. How many children's lives is a billion-dollar profit margin worth? Arthur Sterling has already answered that question. The people of Riverwood are living and dying with his answer. The Sentinel published The Town That Sterling Poisoned on a Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, it had been shared 100,000 times on social media. By Monday evening, it was the top story on every major news website. By Tuesday, protests had erupted outside Sterling Tower. Thousands of people filled the streets, holding signs with Emma Harrison's photograph, with quotes from Sterling's memos, with simple, damning words: poisoner, murderer, justice for Riverwood. The hashtag Sterling poisoned a town trended worldwide. Celebrities tweeted about it. Politicians issued statements. Environmental groups filed emergency petitions. The EPA announced an immediate investigation. The FBI opened a criminal inquiry. And Arthur Sterling's carefully constructed public image, the brilliant entrepreneur, the job creator, the captain of industry, shattered like glass. Elena watched the news coverage from a booth at a diner, her laptop open, her coffee growing cold. She saw footage of Sterling's lawyers holding a press conference, denying everything, claiming the documents were fabricated, threatening legal action against the Sentinel. But their denials rang hollow. David Chen had done his work too well. He had verified everything. He had interviewed independent experts who confirmed the chemical analyses. He had obtained EPA reports that showed contamination in Riverwood's water supply. The evidence was overwhelming. Sterling Corp's stock price began to fall. First a trickle, then a flood. Investors were panicking. By the end of the week, Sterling had lost $3 billion in market value. But Elena wasn't satisfied. This was just phase 1. The wound was open. Now it was time to make sure it couldn't heal. While Sterling and his army of lawyers were frantically trying to contain the Riverwood disaster, Elena initiated phase 2. she sent David Chen the complete Phoenix Fund files. The story, titled Sterling's Ghosts, The Startups He Killed, was published 2 weeks after the Riverwood article. It told the stories of 47 companies, brilliant, innovative startups that had been systematically destroyed by Sterling Corp's predatory tactics. Chen interviewed the founders, many of whom had lost everything: their life savings, their dreams, years of work stolen and repurposed. One founder, a woman named Dr. Sarah Kim, who had developed a revolutionary water purification technology, broke down crying during her interview. "I could have helped people," she said. "My technology could have provided clean water to millions of people in developing countries. But Sterling stole my patents, buried the technology, and bankrupted my company. He didn't even use what he stole. He just didn't want anyone else to have it." The article revealed the systematic nature of Sterling's theft, the infiltration, the surveillance, the coordinated assault. It showed that Arthur Sterling's success wasn't built on innovation or hard work. It was built on parasitism. He was a corporate vampire, feeding on the creativity and passion of others. The reaction was swift and brutal. Every tech CEO in Silicon Valley publicly condemned Sterling. Venture capital firms announced they would no longer work with any Sterling Corp subsidiaries. Universities announced they were returning Sterling's donations and removing his name from buildings. Arthur Sterling's reputation as a business genius was replaced with a new narrative. He was a thief, a fraud, a man who had built his empire on the stolen dreams of better people. Inside Sterling Tower, panic had set in. Elena knew this because she was still monitoring the Nightingale server. Sterling's security team hadn't yet discovered the breach. They were too busy fighting the PR nightmare engulfing the company. Elena could read their internal memos, their crisis management strategies, their increasingly desperate communications. One memo from Arthur Sterling to his executive team was particularly revealing. "This is a coordinated attack. Someone is feeding information to the press. Someone inside or with access to our systems. Jensen, I want a full internal audit. Every employee, every contractor, every vendor. Find the leak. I don't care how long it costs. Find them." Marcus Jensen, Sterling's head of security, responded within hours. "Initiating Operation Ghost Hunt. Full forensic analysis of all server access logs. Complete background checks on all personnel with security clearance. Estimated timeline, 4 to 6 weeks. Will identify the leak." Elena felt a cold chill run down her spine. They were coming for her. They didn't know who she was yet, but they were hunting. She needed to move faster. She needed to end this before Jensen's investigation led him to her door. It was time for Phase 3, the final blow. Elena prepared to send David Chen the Union Matter file, the evidence of Frank Costello's murder. But before she could, something happened that changed everything. Jensen's team made a breakthrough. Elena saw it in an internal memo marked "Urgent." Initial forensic analysis complete. Unauthorized access to Nightingale's server detected. Access occurred on 04/02/2025 at 11:47 p.m. using Emergency Contingency Protocol. User credentials master/emergency_key. The breach originated from an external IP address routed through a VPN, but we have isolated the general geographic location. Riverside District, likely from a public access point, such as a library or internet cafe. cross-referencing with kiming of first leaked document, Miller Bribery, which appeared approximately 72 hours after breach. High confidence that breach and leaks are connected. Current status: reviewing security footage from all public computer access points in Riverside District during relevant time window. Estimated time to identify suspect: 48 to 72 hours. Recommendation: expedite investigation. Our ghost is close. Elena's hands shook as she read the memo. They had traced the breach back to the Riverside District. They were reviewing security camera footage. She thought back to that night at the library, the first night she had accessed the Nightingale server. Had she been careful enough? Had she chosen a computer terminal that was out of camera view? She thought she had, but she couldn't be certain. If Jensen found footage of her, it was over. Sterling's lawyers would destroy her. They would paint her as a criminal, a thief, someone who had illegally accessed private systems. They would deflect attention from Sterling's crimes by focusing on hers. And with her as a discredited source, all the evidence she had gathered would be tainted. Elena looked at the clock. If Jensen's timeline was accurate, she had maybe 2 days, maybe 3 if she was lucky. She needed to deliver the final blow now, before they found her. She opened the Union Matter file, the evidence of Frank Costello's murder, and began composing an email to David Chen. But as she wrote, she realized something crucial. This evidence wasn't like the others. Riverwood was environmental crime. Phoenix Fund was corporate espionage. Both were serious, but they were crimes that people expected from corporations. They were almost normalized in the public consciousness. Terrible, but not shocking. Murder was different. Murder would change everything. Murder would mean criminal charges that couldn't be deflected or settled. Murder would mean Arthur Sterling in handcuffs. Murder would mean justice. But it also meant the story would immediately shift from journalism to law enforcement. The FBI would seize the evidence. Sterling would be arrested. And in the chaos of a criminal investigation, the question would inevitably arise: where did this evidence come from? How did the journalist get access to Sterling's private server? Who was Veritas? And Elena realized with cold clarity, once the murder evidence went public, Sterling's lawyers would stop focusing on damage control. They would focus on finding her, because she would be their best defense. Discredit the source, discredit the evidence. Jensen's investigation would shift into high gear. They would have the FBI's resources backing them. They would find her. It was inevitable. She needed an exit strategy, a way to deliver the final blow and disappear before the hammer came down. Elena stood up from her laptop and paced her small apartment. Sophia was at work. Leo was at school. She was alone with her thoughts and her fear. She could run, take the murder evidence, send it to David Chen, and disappear. Leave the city, change her name, start over somewhere else. But that meant abandoning Sophia and Leo. It meant running for the rest of her life. Or she could stay and finish what she started. Send the evidence, accept that they would eventually find her, and hope that by the time they did, Arthur Sterling would already be behind bars. Neither option was good, but one was right. Elena had started this war not for revenge, though revenge was sweet, but for justice, for Roberto, for Leo, for the people of Riverwood, for Frank Costello and his family, for all the victims of Arthur Sterling's monstrous ambition. If she ran now, she would be abandoning them. She would be choosing her own safety over their justice. And Elena Morales had not come this far to abandon the fight now. She sat back down at her laptop and began to write. Mr. Chen, what I'm about to send you is different from everything else. This is not financial crime. This is not corporate malfeasance. This is murder. Arthur Sterling ordered the assassination of a union organizer named Frank Costello. The attached files contain the evidence, financial records, emails, and communications that establish a clear chain from Sterling to a contract killer to Costello's death. This is the end of Arthur Sterling. When you publish this, he will be arrested. He will go to prison. Justice will be served. But you need to understand something. When this story breaks, Sterling's entire legal apparatus will focus on one thing: finding me. They will want to discredit the source to discredit the evidence. They may succeed in identifying me. They may destroy my life in the process. I'm telling you this because you need to be prepared. The evidence I've given you is genuine. You've already verified that with the previous stories. But Sterling's lawyers will try to make this about me instead of about him. They will call me a criminal, a hacker, someone with an axe to grind. Don't let them. The evidence speaks for itself. Frank Costello's family deserves justice. The people of Riverwood deserves justice. All of Sterling's victims deserve justice. Publish this story, Mr. Chen, and know that whatever happens to me, it was worth it. P.S. I'm not Veritas anymore. I'm done hiding behind a code name. If Sterling's lawyers come for me, let them. Let the world know who I am. Let them know that the woman who brought down a billionaire was a grandmother, a widow, a cleaning lady he fired over a smudge on a picture frame. Let them know that he was brought down by someone he considered invisible. That feels like justice, too. Elena sent the email with the murder evidence attached. Then she sat back and waited. She didn't have to wait long. 16 hours later, the Sentinel published its final story. The murder that built an empire. Leaked files show Sterling ordered hit on union leader. The reaction was instantaneous and apocalyptic. Every news network led with the story. Social media exploded. The hashtag Sterling Murderer trended worldwide within an hour. And the FBI, armed with David Chen's evidence, obtained an emergency warrant for Arthur Sterling's arrest. The scene, broadcast live from dozens of news helicopters circling Sterling Tower, was cinematic in its finality. A convoy of black FBI vehicles pulled up to the front entrance. Agents in tactical gear swarmed into the building. Inside, Arthur Sterling was in his office, that temple of power at the top of the tower, when they came for him. Marcus Jensen tried to intervene, putting himself between Sterling and the agents, but he was quickly pushed aside. Sterling's lawyers were screaming about warrants and due process, but the agents ignored them. And Arthur Sterling, the titan, the god, the man who had believed himself untouchable, was read his rights and placed in handcuffs. As the agents led him out of Sterling Tower, past the employees who had feared him, past the executives who had enabled him, past the protesters who had gathered to witness his fall, the cameras caught his face. He wasn't angry. He wasn't defiant. He was simply blank. A man who had just discovered that the rules he thought governed the universe didn't apply after all. A man who had just learned that there were still consequences in the world. As Sterling was placed into the back of an FBI vehicle, his eyes scanned the crowd. He was looking for someone.
His equal. His worthy adversary.
the brilliant mastermind who had orchestrated his downfall. He was looking for someone powerful, someone connected, someone who mattered. He never once looked at the ordinary people on the sidewalk, the workers, the protesters, the invisible masses he had spent his life stepping over. He never saw Elena Morales standing in that crowd, wearing a simple coat and holding her grandson's hand. He never knew that the ghost who had destroyed him was the cleaning lady he had fired over a smudge. And somehow that made his defeat even more complete. The trial of Arthur Sterling became the most watched legal proceeding in decades. The charges were overwhelming: conspiracy to commit murder, environmental crimes, wire fraud, racketeering, bribery of public officials, and violations of federal securities law. The evidence was irrefutable, not because Sterling's lawyers weren't good, they were excellent, but because Elena's documentation was too thorough, too detailed, too damning. The trial lasted 11 weeks. Elena watched it from the same apartment where she had first smoothed out that crumpled piece of paper, where her desperate gamble had begun. The prosecution built their case methodically. They started with Riverwood, bringing in residents to testify. Jennifer Harrison took the stand and told the jury about her daughter Emma's leukemia. She held up a photograph of Emma before she got sick, a smiling, healthy little girl with long, dark hair. Then she held up a more recent photograph. Emma bawled from chemotherapy, her skin pale, her eyes tired. "My daughter is 8 years old," Jennifer said, her voice shaking but strong. "She should be worried about her homework and what doll to play with. Instead, she's worried about whether she'll live to see her 9th birthday. And the man sitting in that defendant's chair," she pointed directly at Sterling, "he knew this would happen. He calculated the cost of my daughter's suffering and decided it was acceptable." Sterling's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Lawrence Breckenridge, who cost $3,000 an hour, tried to poke holes in the evidence. He suggested the documents might have been altered. He suggested that Sterling couldn't have known the full extent of the environmental damage. He suggested that the responsibility lay with middle managers who had exceeded their authority. But the prosecution had Sterling's own emails, his own signature on approval documents, his own words, "proceed as planned." The Phoenix Fund victims testified next. One by one, the entrepreneurs whose companies Sterling had destroyed told their stories. Dr. Sarah Kim, the water purification researcher, described how years of work had been stolen and suppressed. A young man named James Porter explained how his revolutionary medical diagnostic startup had been infiltrated, copied, and crushed, and how he had lost his house, his marriage, and nearly his life to depression as a result. Sterling sat through it all with a face of stone, showing no emotion. His lawyers advised him not to testify. It was too risky. The prosecution would destroy him on cross-examination. But the climax of the trial was the Frank Costello murder charge. Frank Costello's widow, Maria, took the stand. She was a small woman in her 60s, wearing a simple black dress. She had once been vibrant, but grief had aged her, carved lines into her face, stooped her shoulders. Frank was a good man, she told the jury, her voice barely above a whisper. He worked hard, he loved his family. He fought for his co-workers because he believed people deserve dignity, deserve fair wages, deserve to be safe at work. Is that wrong? Is that a crime? She looked directly at Arthur Sterling. "You took him from me. You took him from our children, from our grandchildren. You had him murdered because he was inconvenient to your profit margins. How much is a human life worth to you, Mr. Sterling? Can you tell me? What's the number? Sterling stared back at her with those cold, pale eyes. He said nothing. The prosecution presented the evidence, the financial records showing the payment to Victor Crosney, the emails between Sterling and Jensen, the timeline that showed Costello's death occurring exactly 3 weeks after the payment cleared. Sterling's lawyers tried to argue that the emails were ambiguous, that permanent resolution could mean legal action or public relations strategies. But the jury didn't buy it. The pattern was too clear, the evidence was too damning. On a Thursday afternoon in late August, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty. On all counts. 17 guilty verdicts, each one read aloud by the jury foreman, each one a nail in the coffin of Arthur Sterling's empire. The courtroom erupted. Victims' families wept. Protesters outside cheered. Sterling's lawyers immediately began filing appeals, but everyone knew they were futile gestures. The evidence was too strong, the conviction too solid. 6 weeks later, Arthur Sterling was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. At 62 years old, it was effectively a life sentence. As the judge read the sentence, Sterling finally showed emotion. Not remorse, he was incapable of that, but shock, pure, uncomprehending shock. The universe had betrayed him. The rules he had lived by, that power and money made you untouchable, had turned out to be lies. He was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, and he would spend the rest of his life in a cell at ADX Florence, a supermax prison in Colorado where inmates spend 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. His empire of glass and steel and power would be replaced by a concrete box 8 feet by 12 feet. Arthur Sterling, who had once looked down on the world from his tower in the clouds, would spend the remainder of his days staring at a concrete wall. But Elena's story didn't end with Sterling's conviction. In the weeks following Sterling's arrest, Marcus Jensen's investigation into the ghost had continued with renewed urgency. He had reviewed security footage from every library in the Riverside district. He had analyzed timestamps, cross-referenced terminal usage logs, tracked IP addresses. And he had found her. A grainy security camera image of a woman in her 50s sitting at a computer terminal in the corner of the Riverside Public Library, her face partially obscured but visible enough for facial recognition software to identify. Elena Morales, former cleaning staff, fired 3 months before the first leak. Jensen had delivered his findings to what remained of Sterling Corp's legal team. They had immediately filed criminal charges against Elena for unauthorized computer access, theft of proprietary information, and corporate espionage. The FBI had arrived at Elena's apartment on a Tuesday morning. Elena had been making breakfast for Leo when she heard the knock. She had known instantly what it meant. She had been expecting it. She opened the door with steady hands. "Elena Morales?" the lead agent asked. "Yes. We have a warrant for your arrest." Sophia had been getting ready for work when she heard the commotion. She rushed into the room, saw her mother being handcuffed, and screamed, "Mama, what's happening? What are you doing to her?" "It's okay, mija," Elena said calmly. "Everything is okay. Take care of Leo. I will be fine." But Sophia grabbed Elena's arm, her face desperate. "Mama, what did you do?" Elena looked her daughter in the eyes and said quietly, what needed to be done. Elena was taken to federal holding, processed, and charged with multiple counts of computer fraud and theft. Sterling Corp's lawyers were demanding the maximum sentence, 20 years in federal prison. But something unexpected happened. David Chen published one final story, "The Woman Who Brought Down a Billionaire." The article told Elena's complete story, her decades of loyal service, her husband's death in Sterling's factory, her grandson's illness, her firing over a thumbprint on a picture frame, her desperate decision to use the password she had found, her months-long investigation, her strategic campaign of revelation. Chen included Elena's final email to him, the one where she had revealed her real name. He included quotes from Sophia, who described her mother as the most honest person I've ever known, someone who spent her whole life following the rules until the rules protected monsters. He included medical records showing Leo's deteriorating condition and the crushing cost of his medication. He included testimonies from Elena's former co-workers at Sterling Corp, who described her as meticulous, kind, and utterly professional. And Chen ended the article with a simple question. Who is the criminal? The billionaire who poisoned a town, stole from innovators, and ordered a murder? Or the grandmother who exposed him? The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. #FreeElena began trending worldwide. A legal defense fund was established and raised $2 million in 72 hours. Prominent lawyers volunteered to represent Elena pro bono. Civil rights organizations issued statements of support. The people of Riverwood held a rally in Elena's honor. Jennifer Harrison stood at a podium, her daughter Emma beside her. Emma, whose cancer was now in remission thanks to the medical treatment funded by Sterling's seized assets, and said, "This woman saved my daughter's life. This woman saved our town. She's not a criminal. She's a hero." Even some of the stolen startup's founders came to Elena's defense. Dr. Sarah Kim, the water purification researcher, gave an interview. "Elena Morales did what our legal system failed to do. She held a powerful criminal accountable. Without her courage, Sterling would still be destroying lives. She should be given a medal, not a prison sentence." The pressure on prosecutors became enormous. Politicians who had once received Sterling's bribes and who were now under their own investigations distanced themselves from the case against Elena. The district attorney, reading the political winds, announced that the charges against Elena would be reduced to a single misdemeanor count of unauthorized computer access. Elena's lawyers negotiated a plea deal: 3 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and a suspended sentence. She would not go to prison. When the deal was announced in court, Elena stood before the judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Judge Patricia Crawford, who looked at her over reading glasses and said, "Mrs. Morales, what you did was technically illegal. The law does not permit individuals to access private computer systems without authorization, regardless of their motivations. However, the law also does not exist in a vacuum. It exists to serve justice. And in this case, your actions, while outside the boundaries of legal procedure, served justice in a way our institutions failed to do." Judge Crawford paused, then continued. "You exposed terrible crimes. You saved lives. You brought a murderer to justice. The court recognizes that your actions, while legally questionable, were morally sound. This plea agreement is appropriate. But Mrs. Morales," the judge looked directly at Elena, "don't do it again." A ripple of laughter went through the courtroom. Elena, with the ghost of a smile, replied, "I won't need to, Your Honor." The dismantling of Sterling's empire took months. The federal government seized his assets under RICO statutes, his mansion, his art collection, his offshore accounts. Everything was liquidated. A multi-billion-dollar restitution fund was established, divided among Sterling's various victims. The people of Riverwood received funding for a state-of-the-art water treatment facility, comprehensive medical monitoring for all residents, and individual settlements that, while they couldn't undo the damage, at least provided financial security and access to quality health care. Frank Costello's widow, Maria, received a substantial settlement. She used part of it to establish a scholarship fund in her husband's name for the children of union workers. The Phoenix Fund victims, the 47 companies Sterling had destroyed, received restitution as well. Some used the money to restart their businesses. Others, too scarred by the experience, simply tried to rebuild their lives. Sterling Corp itself was broken up. The conglomerate that had once dominated multiple industries was divided and sold off in pieces. The company that had carried Arthur Sterling's name ceased to exist. And Elena received an unexpected envelope in the mail. Sound effect. Envelope being opened. Paper unfolding. It was from Solstice Innovations, the solar technology startup that Elena had saved with her very first warning, before the public campaign had even begun. Inside was a cashier's check for $100,000 and a handwritten note. Dear Mrs. Morales, you don't know us, but you saved our company and our dream. Your warning gave us time to protect ourselves from Sterling's attack. Because of you, we were able to complete our merger and bring our technology to market. We've since learned that you were the anonymous source, Veritas, who exposed Sterling's crimes. We've learned about your grandson's illness. We've learned about everything you risked and everything you endured. This money is not payment. You can't pay someone for saving your life's work. But we hope it helps. We hope it gives your family some security. We hope it shows you that your courage mattered, not just in the abstract sense of justice, but in the concrete sense of lives changed and dreams preserved. Thank you for your bravery. Thank you for your sacrifice. Thank you for seeing us when we were invisible to everyone else. With deepest gratitude and respect, Michael and Sarah Chen, co-founders, Solstice Innovations. Elena sat at her kitchen table and cried. Not tears of sadness or pain, but tears of relief and exhaustion and profound, overwhelming gratitude. The money was more than a lifeline. It was vindication. It was proof that her actions had meaning beyond Sterling's downfall. She had saved these people, and they had not forgotten. The first thing Elena did was take Leo to see a specialist. Not the overworked doctors at the free clinic, but the best pediatric pulmonologist in the state. The doctor reviewed Leo's case, adjusted his medication, and recommended a new treatment protocol that insurance had previously deemed not medically necessary. Within 2 months, Leo's breathing improved dramatically. The constant wheeze that had haunted Leo's dreams began to fade. Leo started running again, playing with his friends, living the childhood he deserved. One afternoon, Elena watched from a park bench as Leo played soccer with other children from his school. He was running full speed, his face flushed with exertion and joy, his laughter carrying across the field. Sophia sat beside her mother, her own face healthier now, the dark circles under her eyes finally fading. She had been able to quit one of her 2 jobs. They had moved to a better apartment in a safer neighborhood. For the first time in years, Sophia could breathe too. "Mama," Sophia said quietly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course, mija." "When you decided to do what you did, when you decided to go after Sterling, were you scared?" Elena watched Leo score a goal, his teammates cheering and hugging him. Terrified, she admitted. Every single day. Then why did you do it? Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, because being scared of what might happen was easier than living what was already happening. I was watching you work yourself to death. I was watching Leo struggle to breathe. I was watching a man who had taken your father from me continue to take and take and take, destroying everything he touched. And I realized that I had a choice. I could accept that this was just how the world worked, that people like us don't matter and people like Sterling are untouchable, or I could fight back. She turned to look at her daughter. I chose to fight. And yes, I was scared, but fear isn't a good reason to let evil win. Sophia took her mother's hand and squeezed it tightly. I'm proud of you, Mama. Scared for you sometimes, but proud. I'm proud of you too, Mija. You're stronger than you know. They sat in comfortable silence, watching Leo play, feeling the warm sun on their faces, experiencing a peace that had been absent from their lives for far too long. Elena's community service hours, 500 of them, to be completed over 3 years, were served at the Riverside Public Library, the same library where she had first accessed Sterling's server, the same library where her war had begun. It felt fitting. She worked in the literacy program, helping adults improve their reading skills. She assisted people with job applications, teaching them how to write resumes and navigate online employment systems. She helped elderly patrons learn to use email so they could stay in touch with distant grandchildren. The work was quiet and humble, exactly the kind of work Elena had always done. But now, when she walked through the library's doors, people recognized her. They smiled. They thanked her. She was no longer invisible. One afternoon, as Elena was helping a young mother fill out a job application, David Chen walked into the library. Elena looked up, surprised. She and David had exchanged emails after the trial, but they had never met in person. Mr. Chen, he said, approaching her desk, I wasn't expecting to see you here. I was hoping we could talk, if you have time. They sat in a quiet corner of the library, surrounded by shelves of books, stories of heroes and villains, of justice and injustice, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. David said, I wanted to thank you for trusting me, for giving me the biggest story of my career. He paused, searching for words. For words. For reminding me why I became a journalist. Elena shook her head. I should be thanking you. Without your courage, without your skill, the evidence would have meant nothing. You made people understand. You made them pair. We were partners, David said. A strange partnership, but effective. He smiled. The ghost and the journalist. Not a ghost anymore, Elena said quietly. I'm tired of being invisible. David nodded. Then he said, I'm writing a book about the whole story. Sterling, Riverwood, the investigation, your role in bringing him down. I wanted to ask your permission, and I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to be interviewed, to tell your story in your own words. Elena considered this. For a moment, her instinct was to refuse, to stay quiet, to fade back into anonymity. But then she thought of all the other Elenas in the world, the invisible workers, the people society looked past, the ones who cleaned the floors and served the food and did the work that kept civilization running while being treated as if they didn't matter. Maybe her story could matter to them. Maybe it could show them that being underestimated, being invisible, didn't mean being powerless. Yes, Elena said. I'll do the interviews. Tell the story. All of it. The good and the bad. David smiled. Thank you. What do you want the book to be called? Elena thought for a moment. Then she said, call it The Cleaner Who Erased a Billionaire. Because that's what happened. He thought he had erased me. But in the end, I erased him. A year after Sterling's conviction, Elena made a journey. She took a bus to Riverwood, Ohio, the town she had saved but had never visited. It was a crisp autumn day, the kind where the air smells of fallen leaves and wood smoke. The sky was impossibly blue. Riverwood had changed. The new water treatment facility hummed at the edge of town, its modern architecture a stark contrast to the older buildings around it. A new community health clinic stood where a dilapidated building had once been. The town square had been renovated, with new benches and planters full of flowers. But the town still bore scars. Empty storefronts from businesses that had failed, houses that looked tired and worn. The damage Sterling had done couldn't be fully repaired, not in a year, maybe not ever. But Riverwood was healing. Slowly, painfully, but healing. Elena walked through the town. Just another anonymous woman in a simple coat. No one recognized her. She had specifically asked the media not to publish photographs of her face. She valued her privacy, her ability to move through the world without being watched. She found the cemetery on a hill overlooking the town. She walked among the headstones until she found what she was looking for. A section of newer graves. Children, mostly. Names and dates that told heartbreaking stories. Lived only 4 years. Lived only 9 years. Lived only 12 years. Victims of Sterling's poison. Elena knelt in the grass, her hand resting on one small headstone. A boy named Thomas Miller. He had been 6 years old when he died of leukemia. I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm so sorry I didn't know in time. She stayed there for a long time, paying her respects to the children she had been too late to help. She cried for them, for their families, for all the pain that could have been prevented if someone had stopped Arthur Sterling years earlier. But she also felt a deep, profound sense of purpose. Because of her actions, no more names would be added to this section of the cemetery. The poison had been stopped. The children being born in Riverwood now would drink clean water. They would have futures. As Elena stood to leave, she noticed a woman approaching. Late 30s, dark hair, tired eyes. She was carrying a small bouquet of flowers. The woman stopped near Elena, knelt at one of the graves, and began to arrange the flowers. After a moment, she spoke without looking up. Are you visiting someone? No, Elena said softly. I'm just paying my respects. The woman nodded. This is my nephew. He was 8 years old. She touched the headstone gently. We didn't know why he got sick. The doctors couldn't explain it. We thought it was just bad luck. God's will. Something. She finally looked up at Elena. Then we found out it wasn't God's will. It was a man's choice. A billionaire decided that saving money was more important than our children's lives. I'm so sorry, Elena said, meaning it with her whole heart. The man who did this is in prison now, the woman continued, because someone had the courage to expose him. Someone cared enough to fight back. She stood up, wiping tears from her face. I don't know who that person was, but I think about them every day. I hope they know that what they did mattered. I hope they're a hero. Elena felt tears welling in her own eyes. I'm sure they know, she managed to say. The woman nodded, gave a sad smile, and walked away. Elena stood there for a long time after the woman left, looking out over Riverwood. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the town. In the distance, she could see children playing in a park, running, laughing, alive. I know, Elena whispered to the empty air. I know it mattered. 2 years after Arthur Sterling's conviction, Elena Morales had built a life she never thought possible. Not a life of wealth or fame. She had no interest in those things. But a life of peace, dignity, and purpose. A life where she was visible on her own terms. The money from Solstice Innovations had been carefully invested with the help of a financial advisor recommended by David Chen. It provided a modest but steady income that supplemented Elena's part-time work at the Botanical Gardens. Yes, Elena had found a new job, not out of necessity, but out of desire. The Riverside Botanical Gardens was a green oasis in the heart of the city, 30 acres of carefully tended plants, winding paths, and quiet beauty. Elena worked 3 days a week as a gardening assistant, helping to maintain the flower beds and vegetable gardens. The work was physical but gentle. It was meditative. She spent her days with her hands in soil, coaxing life from the earth. She planted seeds and watched them grow. She pruned roses and dead-headed petunias. She pulled weeds and watered seedlings. It was the opposite of everything Arthur Sterling had represented. Sterling had built towers of steel and glass, monuments to domination and power. Elena grew flowers, small, fragile, beautiful things that existed for no purpose except to bloom and make the world a little more lovely. She worked alongside people who treated her with respect. The head gardener, a soft-spoken man named Marcus, no relation to Sterling's Marcus, thankfully, praised her careful attention to detail. The other staff members invited her to lunch, asked about her grandson, shared stories about their own families. She was not invisible here. She was seen. She was valued. Sophia had enrolled in nursing school. With the financial pressure lifted, she had finally been able to pursue the career she had always dreamed of. She studied at night while working reduced hours at the hospital, and she was thriving. She was good at it, patient, compassionate, technically skilled. "I want to help people," she had told her mother, "the way nurses helped Leo, the way people helped us when we needed it most." Elena couldn't have been more proud. And Leo was flourishing. He was 9 years old now, healthy and energetic. His respiratory condition was well managed with proper medication and regular monitoring. He played sports, excelled in school, and had recently developed a passionate interest in environmental science. "I want to study water quality when I grow up," he had announced at dinner one night. "I want to make sure nobody poisons people's water like that bad man did to Riverwood." Sophia and Elena had exchanged glances across the table, proud, sad, and hopeful all at once. "That's a wonderful goal, mijo," Elena had said. "The world needs people who protect others." One Saturday afternoon, Elena took Leo to the Botanical Gardens. She wanted to show him where she worked, to share this peaceful place with him. They walked the winding paths together, Leo running ahead and then circling back, his boundless energy a constant joy. Elena showed him the vegetable garden where they grew tomatoes and peppers and squash. She showed him the butterfly garden where monarchs and swallowtails danced among the milkweed. She showed him the pond where koi fish glided through clear water. "It's beautiful, Abuela," Leo said, spinning in a circle with his arms outstretched. "It's like a secret world." "It is beautiful," Elena agreed. "And you know what the best part is? Anyone can come here. Rich people, poor people, everyone. The gardens don't care how much money you have. They're here for everyone." Leo thought about this. Then he said, with the blunt honesty of a 9-year-old, "Not like Mr. Sterling's building. That was only for rich people." Elena knelt down to her grandson's level. "That's right. Mr. Sterling believed that only some people mattered. Only people with money and power deserved good things. But that's not true. Everyone matters, Leo. Everyone deserves beauty and safety and respect. Remember that." "I will, Abuela," promised. Then, with the quick topic changes of childhood, he asked, "Can I feed the koi?" Elena laughed. "Yes, mijo, you can feed the koi." She watched him run to the pond, his movements easy and unencumbered by the wheezing that had once plagued him. She watched him kneel by the water's edge, carefully dropping fish food pellets and giggling as the koi swarmed to the surface. This, Elena thought, was what she had fought for. Not revenge, though revenge had been sweet. Not justice, though justice had been served. She had fought for this, a Saturday afternoon in a garden, watching her grandson play, knowing she had a future. David Chen's book, The Cleaner Who Erased a Billionaire, was published 18 months after Sterling's conviction. It became an instant bestseller. The book told the complete story: Sterling's rise to power, his decades of crimes, Elena's investigation, the strategic campaign of exposure, and the final dramatic arrest and conviction. But what resonated most with readers was Elena's personal story. The invisible woman who had been overlooked her entire life, who had finally been pushed too far, and who had discovered that being underestimated was a kind of superpower. David had dedicated the book to Elena Morales and to all the invisible workers who keep our world running. You are seen, you matter. The book sparked a national conversation about wealth inequality, corporate accountability, and the power of ordinary citizens. It inspired several legislative reforms: stronger environmental protections, stricter oversight of corporate conduct, whistleblower protections for workers who exposed corporate crimes. Universities taught it in ethics classes. High schools assigned it as required reading. It was adapted into a documentary film that was nominated for an Academy Award. And Elena received letters, thousands of them, from people across the country and around the world. From other workers who had been fired unfairly, who had been treated as disposable, who felt invisible in their own lives. Your story gave me courage to speak up. From parents struggling to afford medication for sick children, you showed me that even when the system is rigged, there's still hope. From young people planning careers as journalists, environmental activists, and public defenders, you inspired me to fight for justice. Elena read every letter. She couldn't respond to them all, there were too many, but she read them, and she was humbled by them. She had never intended to become a symbol or inspiration. She had simply done what needed to be done. But if her story could help others find their own courage, could show them that ordinary people have power they didn't know they possessed, then the pain and fear and risk had been worth it. On the 3-year anniversary of Arthur Sterling's arrest, Elena attended a memorial ceremony in Riverwood. The town had erected a monument in the central square, a simple stone pillar with the names of the children who had died from Sterling's poison. At the base of the monument was a plaque that read, "In memory of the children we lost, in honor of those who fought for justice, in hope for a future where no one is invisible." The ceremony was well attended. Families of the victims, town residents, representatives from environmental organizations, even some politicians who had supported the legislative reforms inspired by the Sterling case. Jennifer Harrison spoke, her daughter Emma standing beside her. Emma, who was now 11 years old, her hair grown back, her cancer in remission. "This monument reminds us of what we lost," Jennifer said, "but it also reminds us of what we gained, the knowledge that we matter, that our children matter, that someone cared enough to fight for us." Then Jennifer did something unexpected. She called Elena to the podium. Elena tried to refuse. She didn't like public speaking, didn't like being the center of attention, but the crowd applauded and urged her forward. Sophia, who had come with her, gave her an encouraging smile. Elena approached the podium on shaking legs. She looked out at the crowd, hundreds of faces, all looking at her with respect and gratitude. "I don't know what to say," Elena began, her voice soft. "I'm not good at speeches. I'm just a grandmother who did what any grandmother would do. I protected my family, and in doing that, I tried to protect your families too." She paused, gathering her thoughts. Arthur Sterling thought people like me didn't matter. He thought that because I cleaned his floors, because I was poor, because I was old and female and immigrant, he thought I was invisible. He thought he could erase me and no one would notice or care. Elena's voice grew stronger. But he was wrong. We are not invisible. We matter. The people who clean your offices and serve your food and take care of your children and build your buildings, we matter. We see things. We know things. And when we are pushed too far, we fight back. She looked at the monument, at the names of the children carved in stone. I'm sorry I couldn't save everyone. I'm sorry I wasn't faster, wasn't smarter. But I promise you this. I will spend the rest of my life making sure that what happened here never happens again. That no one else has to lose a child because a rich man decided their lives weren't worth the cost of doing the right thing. The crowd erupted in applause. People were crying, hugging each other, calling out their thanks. Elena stepped away from the podium, overwhelmed. Jennifer Harrison hugged her tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for seeing us." "Thank you for not giving up," Elena replied. After the ceremony, Elena walked to the hill overlooking Riverwood, the same hill where she had stood 2 years earlier. The town below looked different now. Not fully healed, but healing. The new water tower gleamed in the afternoon sun. Children played in clean parks. Life continued. Elena sat on a bench at the summit of the hill, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of orange and gold, like the world was on fire with beauty. She thought about Arthur Sterling, alone in his concrete cell in Colorado. She wondered yet if he had realized that the empire he had built on cruelty and greed had been toppled not by a rival billionaire or a government investigation, but by a cleaning lady he had fired over a thumbprint on glass. Probably not. Men like Sterling never truly understood. They lived their entire lives believing the world operated according to certain rules, that power and money made you untouchable, that ordinary people didn't matter, that you could take and never face consequences. But Elena had rewritten those rules. She had shown that the invisible could become visible, that the powerless could become powerful, that justice, while slow and difficult, was still possible. She thought about her husband, Roberto, who had died in Sterling's factory so many years ago. She hoped, wherever he was, that his death had been avenged, that the company that had killed him had been destroyed, that the man responsible was paying for his crimes. "I did it, mi amor," she whispered to the wind. "I made them pay." As the sun touched the horizon, Elena stood to leave. She had a long bus ride back to the city, and Sophia was making dinner. It was Leo's birthday tomorrow. He was turning 10, and they had plans to celebrate. Life normal and beautiful life was waiting for her. As Elena walked down the hill toward the bus stop, she passed a young woman pushing a stroller. The woman smiled at Elena, a warm, genuine smile of greeting between strangers. "Beautiful evening," the woman said. "Yes," Elena agreed. Such a small moment, an ordinary interaction between two ordinary people. But Elena felt a deep sense of contentment. This was what she had fought for. A world where people could smile at each other, where children could grow up safe, where ordinary days were filled with ordinary kindness. Arthur Sterling had believed that the world was a jungle, that life was a zero-sum game, where some people had to lose for others to win. But Elena knew different. The world could be a garden, and gardens, when tended with care and love, could bloom for everyone. 3 years, 2 months, and 17 days after Arthur Sterling was led away in handcuffs, Elena Morales woke up in her comfortable bed in her safe apartment. She made coffee, real coffee, not the instant kind she had survived on for years. She ate breakfast with Leo before he left for school, reminding him to finish his science project. She kissed Sophia goodbye before her daughter left for nursing school. Then, Elena took the bus to the botanical gardens and spent her day in the soil, helping things grow. She was 61 years old. Her hair was more silver than black now. Her hands were still calloused from decades of work. Her back still ached on cold days. But she was not invisible. Not to her family, who loved her fiercely. Not to her coworkers, who respected her deeply. Not to the people of Riverwood, who remembered her gratefully. Not to the thousands of readers who had written to say her story had inspired them. And certainly not to the man in the concrete cell in Colorado who would spend the rest of his life knowing that he had been brought down by a woman whose name he had never bothered to learn. The smudge that Arthur Sterling had been so disgusted by, the tiny imperfection that had offended his sense of absolute perfection, had expanded and spread until it had erased him completely. The thumbprint of Elena Morales had become the signature on his downfall. And in the space where his empire of cruelty had stood, something new was growing, something clean, something hopeful, something that belonged not to the powerful and the wealthy, but to everyone. Justice, like a garden, takes time to bloom. It requires patience, care, and the quiet, persistent work of people who believe that beauty and fairness are possible even in a harsh world. Elena Morales had planted those seeds, and now, finally, they were beginning to grow.